Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The old house breathed differently after 11/11. I first noticed it during my third night staying at my grandparents' place, when the familiar creak of settling wood transformed into something else entirely. A wheeze, a rattle, as if the walls themselves were struggling for air. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed an accusatory red, 23:11. Every room beyond this bedroom door had become a lung slowly collapsing. My grandfather had mentioned it once, years ago, in passing. Something about how the house got temperamental at night, how it was best to stay put once you'd settled in for the evening. I dismissed it as the eccentric rambling of an old man grown too attached to his routines. Now, 3 weeks after his funeral, alone in this place I'd inherited along with my grief, I understood why he'd spoken of the house as if it were alive. The air conditioning unit hummed its familiar tune, but something felt wrong. The temperature hadn't changed, yet my skin prickled with a different kind of cold, the kind that seeped from the inside out. My throat tightened as I lay in the narrow bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that resembled a grasping hand. The stain had been there since childhood, but tonight it seemed to pulse with each beat of my heart. I'd been staying here for 3 weeks now, sorting through decades of accumulated memories, deciding what to keep and what to let go. During the day, the house felt normal, worn but welcoming, filled with the gentle mustiness of old books and lavender sachets. But every night at exactly 11:11, something shifted. The air grew thick and syrupy, making each breath a conscious effort. The familiar sounds of the house, the settling beams, the humming refrigerator, the distant traffic, all became muffled, as if heard through water. My pulse quickened as I remembered the first night I'd experienced it. I'd been in the kitchen making myself a late snack when the feeling hit like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. The simple act of walking from the kitchen to the bedroom had become a marathon, each step requiring tremendous effort, my lungs working overtime to extract oxygen from air that seemed to have lost its substance. I'd barely made it to the bedroom before collapsing onto the bed, gasping like a drowning man who'd finally broken the surface. The second night, I'd been more prepared. I'd made sure to be in the bedroom well before 11:11, watching the clock with the intensity of a bomb technician. As the minutes ticked over, I'd felt the change like a tide rolling in, subtle at first, then overwhelming. Even with the bedroom door closed, I could sense the heaviness settling over the rest of the house like a suffocating blanket. Tonight was different. Tonight, the curiosity that had always been my weakness was gnawing at me with renewed intensity. What exactly happened out there? Was it truly dangerous or just uncomfortable? My rational mind insisted it was probably just anxiety, grief manifesting in strange ways, my subconscious creating phantom symptoms to match my emotional state. But my body knew better. My body remembered the way my chest had constricted, how my vision had blurred at the edges, the metallic taste that had flooded my mouth as I'd struggled to breathe in that thickened air. The clock read 23:47 now. Whatever phenomenon gripped the house had been in effect for 36 minutes. My curiosity burned hotter than my fear, a dangerous combination that had gotten me into trouble more times than I could count. I told myself I would just crack the door open, just take a quick peek to see if there was anything visibly different about the hallway. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. The brass was cold against my palm, colder than it should have been in the summer heat. I turned it slowly, wincing at the soft click of the mechanism engaging. The door opened barely an inch, and immediately I felt it, that crushing weight pressing against the narrow opening, trying to force its way into my sanctuary. The hallway looked normal. The same family photos lined the walls, the same worn carpet stretched toward the kitchen. But the air shimmered with an almost imperceptible density, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. I held my breath and opened the door another inch. The pressure increased immediately. My chest began to tighten, that familiar sensation of my lungs forgetting how to function properly. I could taste copper on my tongue, and my vision started to tunnel at the edges. This was exactly what had happened the first 2 nights, but now I was experiencing it by choice, conducting my own twisted experiment. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the air conditioning, and my mouth had gone dry as parchment. But along with the fear, I felt something else, a perverse satisfaction. I'd proven to myself that it was real, whatever it was. This wasn't grief-induced hallucination or anxiety attacks. Something genuinely inexplicable was happening in this house every night. The next evening, I prepared more thoroughly. I positioned myself just inside the bedroom door, gathering my courage like armor. I'd spent the day researching everything I could find about unusual atmospheric phenomena, electromagnetic fields, even infrasound frequencies that could cause physical discomfort. None of it explained what I was experiencing, but the research had given me a framework, a way to approach this scientifically rather than surrendering to superstition. At 23:10, I stood with my hand on the doorknob, counting down the seconds. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out the house's normal nighttime symphony. When the digital clock flickered to 23:11, I felt the change immediately, even through the closed door. The air pressure in the bedroom shifted subtly, as if the house were holding its breath. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The sensation hit me like diving into deep water. My ears popped, and that crushing weight settled over my chest with renewed intensity. But this time, I was ready for it. I forced myself to take slow, measured breaths, fighting against my body's instinct to panic. Each inhalation required conscious effort, like trying to breathe through wet concrete, but I managed to stay upright. The hallway stretched before me, looking deceptively normal. I took one step forward, then another. The pressure increased with each movement away from the bedroom, as if the house were warning me back. By the time I reached the living room entrance, my vision was swimming, and my legs felt like lead. But I could see into the living room now, and what I saw made my blood freeze. The furniture had moved. Not dramatically, just enough to be wrong. The coffee table sat at a slightly different angle. The armchair had rotated a few degrees toward the hallway, as if something had been sitting in it, watching the bedroom door. The television remote lay on the floor beside the couch, though I clearly remembered leaving it on the arm. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe I'd misremembered where everything was. Maybe the house settling had shifted things slightly. Maybe the cleaning lady I'd hired had moved items and forgotten to put them back exactly. But deep in my gut, I knew none of those explanations were true. The sofa, my grandfather's ancient brown leather monster that dominated the room, sat in its usual position against the far wall. Or at least, it appeared to. Something about its placement nagged at me, but I couldn't put my finger on what was different. I took another step into the room, fighting against the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. My lungs burned, and sweat dripped down my spine despite the chill that had settled into my bones. The sensation of being watched intensified, making the hair on my neck stand at attention. That's when I noticed the gap. The sofa had moved forward. Just an inch, maybe less, but enough to create a narrow space between its back and the wall where none had existed before. In that gap, something glinted, a reflection of the streetlight filtering through the curtains, bouncing off what looked like glass or metal. My curiosity overrode my survival instincts. I forced myself deeper into the room, each step a monumental effort against the suffocating atmosphere. My heart felt like it might burst from the strain, and black spots danced at the periphery of my vision. But I had to know what was hidden behind that sofa. I was 3 feet away when it happened. The sofa slid. Not slowly, not gradually, but with a deliberate fluid motion that spoke of intent rather than accident. It moved exactly one hand's width forward, the sound of leather against hardwood echoing through the oppressive silence. The gap I'd been approaching vanished completely, the sofa now pressed firmly against the wall. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that it had blocked my path back to the hallway. The sofa now sat at an angle that hadn't existed moments before, its bulk creating a barrier between me and the bedroom door. The space that had been wide enough for comfortable passage was now narrowed to barely the width of my shoulders. And as I stared at it in growing horror, I could swear the sofa shifted again. Just a millimeter, just enough to make the passage even tighter. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to thicken further, if that was possible, and my vision began to tunnel. I was trapped in this room with air that felt like syrup and furniture that moved with malevolent purpose. I stumbled toward the narrowed passage, pressing myself against the wall to squeeze through. But as I approached, the sofa shifted again. Another millimeter, then another. Each movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the cumulative effect was undeniable. The passage was closing. Terror flooded my system, sending adrenaline coursing through my veins. My hands shook uncontrollably, and my mouth had gone so dry I could barely swallow. The metallic taste was back, stronger now, coating my tongue with the flavor of fear. My legs felt like they might give out at any moment. I tried to push past the sofa, to force my way through the narrowing gap, but my oxygen-deprived muscles couldn't generate enough strength. The passage continued to close with each attempt, the sofa responding to my efforts by moving incrementally inward. It was like being trapped in a slowly contracting vice, the walls of my prison closing with inexorable patience. That's when I heard my grandfather's voice in my memory. Not the words he'd spoken about the house being temperamental, but something else. A story he'd told me once when I was very young. Something about respecting the house, about acknowledging its moods, about the importance of asking permission rather than taking liberties. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't dealing with a malfunction or a phenomenon. I was dealing with something that required appeasement, something that demanded acknowledgement. My pride warred with my desperation. The rational part of my mind rebelled against what I was considering, but as the sofa moved another millimeter and my vision began to fade around the edges, survival instinct won. I cleared my throat, though the sound came out as barely more than a croak. The words felt ridiculous, insane, but I forced them out anyway. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the room. "I shouldn't have come out here. I should have respected the rules." Nothing happened for a long moment. The oppressive atmosphere remained, and the sofa stayed in its blocking position. My heart sank, and I wondered if I'd misunderstood, if I was truly losing my mind in the worst possible way. Then, slowly, almost grudgingly, the sofa began to slide backward. The movement was gradual but unmistakable, creating space for me to pass. The passage widened to its original dimensions, and I felt the crushing pressure on my chest ease slightly. Not completely, the suffocating atmosphere remained, but enough for me to draw a deeper breath. I didn't wait to see if the reprieve was temporary. I squeezed through the passage and stumbled down the hallway, my legs barely supporting my weight. Behind me, I heard the soft whisper of leather against wood as the sofa resumed its original position. I collapsed onto the bedroom floor, just as the clock turned to midnight. Immediately, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The air returned to normal, breathable and light. The crushing weight disappeared from my chest, and my vision cleared. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, transforming the house back into the benign structure I knew during daylight hours. I lay on the carpet for a long time, my heart gradually slowing to normal rhythm. My clothes were soaked with sweat, and my hands still trembled from the adrenaline crash. But I was alive, and I was safe, and I had learned something important about this house I'd inherited. It wasn't malevolent exactly. It was territorial. It had rules, boundaries that needed to be respected. My grandfather had known this, had lived with it for decades, finding ways to coexist with whatever presence or force called this place home. The next morning, I found a journal tucked away in my grandfather's bedroom closet. The entries dated back 40 years, documenting his encounters with what he called the house's moods. He'd discovered the 11/11 phenomenon shortly after moving in, and over time had learned to work with it rather than against it. The house, he wrote, demanded respect but offered protection in return. It was a guardian as much as a prisoner, keeping watch over those who belonged while warning away those who didn't. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks before his death, contained a message clearly meant for whoever would inherit the house. It will test you once, maybe twice. Answer with humility, not arrogance. Acknowledge its authority, and it will accept you. Fight it, and you'll never find peace here. I closed the journal and looked around the bedroom that would be mine for the foreseeable future. Outside, the morning sun streamed through the windows, making everything look normal and benign. But I knew that when night fell, when the clock struck 11:11, the house would transform again. The difference was that now I understood the rules. I would stay in the bedroom after 11:11, not because I was trapped, but because I was a guest who had learned proper etiquette. I would respect the house's nightly ritual, its need for solitude and space during those dark hours when whatever presence dwelled here held dominion, and in return, it would let me stay. As I made my breakfast in the kitchen that morning, I noticed the sofa had returned to its exact original position. The coffee table sat at its proper angle, the armchair faced the television, and the remote rested on the arm where I'd left it. Everything was as it should be, as if the previous night's encounter had been nothing more than a vivid dream. But the metallic taste lingered in my mouth, and my chest still ached from the strain of breathing that suffocating air. I knew what I'd experienced was real, just as I knew I would never again challenge the house's authority during those midnight hours. Some boundaries exist for good reason. Some rules are written in something deeper than ink, and some houses remember every slight, every transgression, until proper respect is finally shown. I had learned to apologize to the darkness, and the darkness, in its own way, had forgiven me. Story 2. The house keeps a calendar of its own, marking time not in days or months, but in manifestations that arrive with clockwork precision every October. I should have left after the first year, when I found him standing on the staircase. I should have run after the second, when the transparent cats began their endless prowling. But by the third year, when my dead grandmother started her perpetual muttering in the kitchen, I understood with crystalline clarity that leaving was no longer an option. The house had chosen me, and I had become part of its annual ritual. The first sign always came in September, a subtle shift in the air that made my skin crawl without reason. The house would settle differently, creaking in new patterns that seemed almost like whispered warnings. My pulse would quicken at sounds that had never bothered me before, the furnace clicking on, floorboards expanding in the morning heat, the ancient pipes groaning behind plaster walls. Everything felt wrong, charged with anticipation that made my stomach churn and my hands shake as I reached for my morning coffee. Year 1 introduced me to the man on the stairs. I first noticed him during a restless night in late October, when insomnia had driven me from my bed to pace the darkened hallway. The staircase descended into shadows so thick they seemed solid, and there he stood, motionless on the 7th step, his back turned toward me. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at his perfectly still form, dressed in what appeared to be a charcoal suit that absorbed the faint light filtering through the hall window. Sleep deprivation, I told myself. Stress from the new job, the recent move, the isolation of living alone in a house too large for one person. But when I blinked hard and looked again, he remained exactly where he stood, neither moving up nor down, simply existing in that liminal space between floors. My mouth went dry as I forced myself to call out, my voice cracking with nervous energy. The man didn't respond, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, watching his unmoving silhouette until exhaustion finally drove me back to bed. When I checked again at dawn, the staircase was empty. For the remainder of October, he appeared nightly, always on the 7th step, always facing away, always wearing that same dark suit that seemed to drink light. My sleep became fractured, broken by the compulsive need to check the stairs. Dark circles formed under my eyes, and my hands developed a persistent tremor that made holding my coffee mug a challenge. Colleagues asked if I was feeling well, noting my haggard appearance and distracted demeanor. November 1st arrived like a reprieve. The man vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving behind only the memory of his presence and the certainty that something fundamental had changed in my house. I convinced myself it had been an elaborate trick of light and shadow, a manifestation of stress and sleep deprivation. The rational explanation felt thin as tissue paper, but I clung to it with desperate determination. Winter passed peacefully. Spring brought new hope. I painted the walls, replaced the carpeting, filled the house with light and life. But as September of the second year approached, that familiar dread began building in my chest, a pressure that made breathing difficult and turned my appetite to ash. The transparent cats arrived right on schedule. They materialized in the periphery of my vision, translucent shapes that flickered like heat mirages at the edges of my sight. When I turned to look directly, they would fade to nothing, leaving only the impression of feline movement and the sound of phantom paws padding across hardwood floors. My skin crawled with constant awareness of being watched, studied, evaluated by creatures that existed somewhere between reality and imagination. Unlike the static man on the stairs, these spectral cats were mobile, restless entities that prowled through every room of the house. I would catch glimpses of them slinking around corners, leaping onto furniture that didn't react to their weight, weaving between my legs as I walked. Their presence was everywhere and nowhere, a constant assault on my peripheral vision that left me spinning in circles, chasing shadows that dissolved the moment I focused on them. The sensation of their ghostly fur brushing against my skin became unbearable. Phantom whiskers tickled my ankles, invisible bodies wound around my legs, and the soft pressure of paws walking across my chest woke me every night. My nerves frayed to breaking point as I jumped at every flicker of movement, every play of light across the walls. Coffee cups slipped from my shaking hands, and I found myself talking to empty rooms, pleading with unseen cats to leave me alone. Sleep became impossible. The transparent felines seemed most active in darkness, their barely visible forms creating a constant light show of movement that kept my eyes darting frantically around the room. I installed motion sensor lights, but they triggered randomly throughout the night, responding to presences I couldn't see but somehow detected. The house filled with the mechanical clicking of sensors and the harsh glare of LED bulbs that revealed nothing but empty spaces where I was certain I had seen cat-shaped shadows. By mid-November, I was a wreck. My hands shook constantly, my weight had dropped 20 pounds, and my eyes had developed a wild, hunted look that made strangers cross the street to avoid me. But November brought the same relief as the previous year. The cats faded away, leaving behind only the memory of their ghostly touch and the growing certainty that my house operated on a schedule I didn't understand. I spent the winter researching the property's history, digging through public records and newspaper archives with the desperate hope of finding rational explanations. The house had been built in 1923, had changed hands 7 times, and had no recorded incidents of violent death or tragedy. Previous owners had simply moved away, selling quickly and quietly, leaving no forwarding addresses or explanations. Year 3 brought my grandmother back from the dead. She appeared in the kitchen on October 1st, standing at the counter where she had spent countless hours during my childhood visits. Her familiar form hunched over the sink, muttering in the low, continuous stream of Portuguese complaints that had been the soundtrack of her life. My grandmother had been dead for 15 years, buried in the cemetery across town after a quiet funeral that I had attended with mixed feelings of grief and relief. Yet there she stood, solid and real, wearing the same faded house dress and torn slippers that had been her uniform during her final years. Her gray hair was pulled back in the tight bun I remembered, and her gnarled hands moved constantly as she spoke to invisible listeners in rapid, angry Portuguese. The words were too quick and slurred for me to understand, but the tone was unmistakable. The same bitter complaints about ungrateful children, rising prices, and the general decline of everything she had voiced throughout my childhood. My chest constricted with panic as I watched her familiar movements, the way she wiped the same section of counter over and over, her mouth moving in the endless stream of grievances that death apparently hadn't silenced. When I tried to speak to her, she continued her monologue without pause, as if I didn't exist, or couldn't be heard over the volume of her eternal complaints. The smell of her presence filled the kitchen, a mixture of garlic, mothballs, and the particular mustiness that had clung to her apartment in her final years. The scent triggered memories I had tried to forget, long, uncomfortable visits where she had criticized my appearance, my life choices, my failure to visit more often. Her voice carried the same accusatory tone that had made me avoid her calls and postpone visits until guilt finally drove me to her doorstep. Night after night, she maintained her vigil in the kitchen, muttering her endless litany of complaints while wiping the same spotless counter. The sound of her voice carried through the house, a constant background noise that made concentration impossible. I found myself straining to understand her words, to decipher whether her complaints were general grievances or specific accusations directed at me from beyond the grave. Sleep became impossible with her voice echoing through the house. I tried closing bedroom doors, wearing earplugs, even camping in the backyard, but her muttering seemed to penetrate every barrier I constructed. The sound followed me everywhere, a persistent reminder of family obligations unfulfilled and conversations we would never have. My hands shook as I poured morning coffee, the cup rattling against its saucer while my grandmother's voice provided unwelcome commentary from the kitchen. Work became impossible as her complaints echoed in my head during meetings and phone calls. Colleagues noticed my distraction, my inability to focus on simple tasks, the way I flinched at sudden sounds and jumped when people approached from behind. The familiar pattern held. November 1st brought silence as my grandmother vanished as suddenly as she had appeared. But the relief felt hollow now, tainted by the growing certainty that the house was building toward something, that each annual manifestation was preparation for a final, terrible revelation. I spent year 4 in a state of constant anxiety, dreading October's arrival, while obsessively trying to predict what new horror would join the growing catalog of annual visitations. The man on the stairs, the transparent cats, my grandmother's endless complaints. Each manifestation had been more invasive than the last, more personal, more impossible to ignore or rationalize away. When October came again, I was already a nervous wreck, jumping at every sound and constantly checking over my shoulder. My pulse raced whenever I approached the staircase, expecting to see the man in his charcoal suit. My peripheral vision betrayed me constantly, conjuring cat-shaped shadows that dissolved when I looked directly. The kitchen had become a minefield of memory, every glance triggering the expectation of my grandmother's familiar form hunched over the sink. But this year was different. This year, the house held its breath, waiting. The doorbell rang at 11:47 p.m. on October 15th. The sound cut through the house like a blade, sharp and insistent in the midnight stillness. My heart nearly stopped as I bolted upright in bed, every nerve ending screaming with sudden terror. The brass bell mounted beside the front door had an antique, penetrating tone that seemed to vibrate through the walls and settle in my bones. I lay frozen, staring at the ceiling while my pulse hammered in my ears. The doorbell had been broken since I moved in, a corroded mechanism that hadn't functioned in decades. Yet the sound had been unmistakable, real, impossible to dismiss as imagination or stress-induced hallucination. Silence stretched for long minutes before I forced myself to investigate. My bare feet hit the cold hardwood as I crept through the darkened house, avoiding the 7th step where the man had stood, checking corners for transparent cats, listening for the sound of my grandmother's complaints from the kitchen. Everything was quiet, exactly as it should be in a normal house at nearly midnight. The front door stood solid and unchanged, its deadbolt secure, its brass bell hanging motionless beside the frame. I pressed my face to the window, peering through lace curtains at the empty front porch and the dark street beyond. Nothing moved in the pale glow of street lamps. No cars were parked at the curb. No figures stood waiting in the shadows. But as I turned away from the window, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Wet footprints led from the front door to the center of the entryway, where they simply stopped. Not shoe prints or boot marks, but the bare human impressions of feet that had walked through water or mud. The prints were perfectly clear in the dim light filtering through the front window. 5 toes, heel, arch, all rendered in what looked like dark, viscous liquid that reflected the faint illumination. My hand shook violently as I reached for the light switch, my fingers fumbling against the wall while my eyes remained fixed on those impossible footprints. The overhead light revealed them in horrible detail, not water or mud, but something darker, thicker, that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The prints were fresh, still glistening, and they led directly to the spot where I was standing. The doorbell rang again. This time I watched it happen. The brass bell swayed gently on its mounting, producing that sharp, penetrating tone, while no hand touched it. No finger pressed the button that should have been broken beyond repair. The sound echoed through the house, seeming to wake everything that had ever haunted these rooms. I could feel them stirring, the man on the stairs shifting his weight, the transparent cats beginning their restless prowling, my grandmother's voice rising from the kitchen in agitated Portuguese. But this time, I knew they weren't alone. Standing at the window, I pressed my face against the glass and strained to see through the darkness beyond the porch. The street lamps cast pools of sickly yellow light on empty pavement, and the neighboring houses sat dark and silent behind their drawn curtains. Nothing moved in the visible world, yet something was there. Something that could ring doorbells and leave wet footprints. Something that existed in the space between the annual manifestations that had plagued my house. Something that had been waiting for this moment, this recognition, this final understanding of what the house had been trying to tell me. The footprints began to multiply. As I watched in growing horror, new impressions appeared on the hardwood floor, not advancing toward me, but spreading outward in all directions like a crowd gathering for some terrible ceremony. Dozens of wet prints materialized around my feet, some large, some small, some misshapen in ways that suggested they might not be entirely human. The dark liquid that formed them seemed to pulse with its own life, flowing and shifting while maintaining the basic shape of feet that had never walked on earthly ground. My breath came in sharp, painful gasps as I backed away from the growing congregation of footprints, my own bare feet slipping on the hardwood as terror made my movements clumsy and desperate. The familiar sounds of my annual visitors grew louder. The man on the stairs began to turn. The transparent cats materialized fully visible. My grandmother's complaints rose to an angry shouting that echoed through every room. But these were no longer separate manifestations appearing according to the house's mysterious schedule. They were gathering, responding to the call of whatever stood beyond my front door, whatever had rung the broken bell and left those wet prints as calling cards for the living. I understood then, with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins, that the previous years had been preparation. The man on the stairs had been testing my perception, training me to see what shouldn't exist. The transparent cats had accustomed me to presence without substance, teaching me to accept impossibility as routine. My grandmother's endless complaints had been conditioning, preparing me to hear voices that had no living source. All of it had been leading to this moment, this gathering, this convergence of every horror the house had collected over the decades of its existence. I was not the first person to experience these annual manifestations, nor would I be the last. The house kept its own calendar, its own schedule of visitations, and I had become part of its permanent collection. The doorbell rang a third time, and this time I knew I had to answer. Not because I wanted to, but because the choice was no longer mine to make. The wet footprints had surrounded me completely, forming a circle of dark impressions that seemed to pulse with anticipation. The man on the stairs had turned fully around, revealing a face that was somehow both familiar and impossible to remember. The transparent cats had arranged themselves like sentinels throughout the room, their barely visible forms creating a gauntlet I would have to pass through to reach the door. And from the kitchen, my grandmother's voice had changed from complaints to what sounded almost like encouragement, her Portuguese words taking on a rhythm that suggested instruction, guidance, welcome. My hand reached for the deadbolt without conscious decision, my fingers turning the mechanism while my mind screamed protests that my body ignored. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the house like a bell tolling, and I knew that whatever stood beyond the door had been waiting for this moment as long as I had been dreading it. The door swung open on its own. The porch was empty, exactly as it had appeared through the window. Empty and innocent and perfectly normal in every way, except for the presence I could feel standing just beyond the threshold, waiting for permission to enter that my opened door had just granted. The wet footprints on my floor began to steam, releasing vapors that carried the scent of rain and earth and something deeper, older, that might have been the smell of time itself. The house settled around me with sounds of satisfaction, creaking and sighing like something that had been holding its breath for far too long. I stepped back from the open door, but I didn't run. There was nowhere to go now, nowhere that would be far enough from whatever had been calling the annual manifestations to my house. I was part of the collection now, part of the calendar, part of the schedule that would bring new visitors next October and the October after that. The door closed by itself with a gentle click, and the house fell silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant settling of ancient wood. The wet footprints had dried to dark stains on the hardwood, permanent marks that would serve as evidence of this night for whoever came next. I walked back to my bedroom on unsteady legs, past the empty seventh step, through the now quiet kitchen, beyond the corners where transparent cats no longer prowled. The house felt different now, not haunted, but inhabited, complete, ready for next year's annual cycle to begin. In the morning, I would start making plans to leave, but I already knew they would come to nothing. The house had what it wanted now, what it had been gathering piece by piece through each October's visitation. I was no longer a temporary resident, but a permanent fixture, another manifestation to greet next year's chosen occupant. The thought should have terrified me, but instead it brought an odd sense of peace. The uncertainty was over, the dread finally justified and resolved. I knew my place now in the house's eternal calendar, and there was strange comfort in finally understanding the rules of a game I had been playing blindly for 4 long years. I closed my eyes and waited for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities. After all, someone would need to train next year's resident, to prepare them for what was coming, to help them understand that some invitations once extended can never be withdrawn. The house kept its own time, and I had finally learned to read its calendar. Story 3. Some memories burn themselves into your mind with such intensity that they leave permanent scars on your psyche, festering wounds that never quite heal. They lurk in the shadows of your consciousness, waiting for the perfect moment to resurface and remind you that some things cannot be explained, cannot be rationalized, and certainly cannot be forgotten. The house on Maple Street had been in my family for 3 generations, its weathered clapboard siding and creaking floors holding decades of accumulated secrets. When my grandmother passed last spring, I inherited not just the property but the responsibility of sorting through a lifetime of possessions that had gathered dust in every corner of the old Victorian. I'd been putting off the task for months, finding excuses to delay the inevitable return to a place I'd spent countless summers as a child. The house held too many memories, most of them pleasant, but one in particular that had haunted me for over 20 years. The October wind carried the scent of decay as I pulled into the overgrown driveway, fallen leaves crunching under my tires like brittle bones. The house loomed before me, its dark windows reflecting the overcast sky like empty eye sockets. I sat in my car for several minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel as my heart hammered against my ribs with an intensity that surprised me. My mouth felt dry as cotton, and I found myself staring at the side of the house where the laundry room was located. Even from this distance, even after all these years, I could see the glass door that led from the kitchen to the small enclosed porch where my grandmother had done her washing. The door that had changed everything when I was 8 years old. I forced myself to get out of the car, my legs unsteady as I approached the front steps. The key turned easily in the lock, as if the house was eager to welcome me back. The musty smell hit me immediately, a combination of old wood, mothballs, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The interior was exactly as I remembered it, frozen in time like a museum dedicated to my childhood. Doilies draped over worn furniture, family photographs covering every available surface. and the persistent tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, marking the seconds with metronomic precision. Each footstep on the hardwood floors sent echoes through the empty rooms, as if the house was announcing my presence to unseen occupants. I started in the attic, working my way through boxes of documents and keepsakes, but my attention kept drifting to the sounds below. The house creaked and settled in ways I didn't remember, and more than once I found myself pausing to listen for footsteps that never came. My palms grew slick with perspiration, and I had to wipe them repeatedly on my jeans as I sorted through decades of accumulated belongings. It was while examining a box of old photographs that I first felt the familiar chill creeping up my spine. The images were typical family snapshots spanning several decades, birthday parties and holidays captured in fading color. But as I worked through the chronologically arranged albums, I began to notice something that made my breath catch in my throat. In photograph after photograph taken in the kitchen, there was a consistent anomaly, a dark stain on the glass door of the laundry room that appeared in every image, regardless of when it was taken or who had captured it. The stain was roughly the size and shape of a human head, with wispy tendrils extending outward like smoke or flames frozen in time. My hands began to tremble as I spread the photographs across the dusty floor, arranging them by date. The stain appeared in images from the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, and continued right up until the most recent photos from my grandmother's final years. It was always in the exact same position, always the same size and shape, as if something had burned itself permanently into the glass. The memory I'd tried so hard to suppress came flooding back with nauseating clarity. I was 8 years old, staying with my grandmother for the summer, helping her with household chores. I'd been in the kitchen, reaching for a glass of water, when I glanced toward the laundry room door. Through the glass, I saw a face. Not human, not entirely, but recognizable as such in the way that nightmares are recognizable as distorted versions of reality. The head was wreathed in flames that didn't seem to give off heat or light, tongues of fire that moved with liquid grace around features that shifted and blurred like smoke. But the smile was unmistakable. A wide, knowing grin that seemed to acknowledge my presence and find it amusing. I'd stood frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, my young mind struggling to process what it was seeing. The thing tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, and the smile widened. Then it was gone, leaving only the faint impression of something burned into the glass. When I'd tried to tell my grandmother what I'd seen, she'd dismissed it as an overactive imagination, the product of too many scary movies and not enough sleep. But I'd known what I'd seen, and I'd spent the rest of that summer avoiding the kitchen whenever possible, especially after dark. Now, sitting on the attic floor surrounded by photographic evidence that I wasn't crazy, that something had indeed left its mark on that glass door, I felt my hands shaking uncontrollably. The familiar taste of copper filled my mouth, and I realized I'd been biting my lip hard enough to draw blood. I gathered the photographs with trembling fingers and made my way downstairs, each step feeling like a descent into something I wasn't prepared to face. The kitchen looked exactly as it had all those years ago. The same yellow wallpaper with tiny flowers, the same linoleum floor with its pattern of worn spots where generations of my family had walked, and there was the door, its glass panels reflecting the afternoon light filtering through the kitchen windows. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. My breathing had become shallow and rapid, and I had to lean against the counter to steady myself as I examined the glass. The stain was there, exactly as it appeared in the photographs. A dark, sooty mark that seemed to have been etched into the glass itself, immune to decades of cleaning attempts. I could see scratch marks around its edges where someone, probably my grandmother, had tried to scrub it away. But the stain remained, as permanent as a scar. I reached out to touch it, then pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. The glass felt cold against my fingertips, but the area around the stain seemed to radiate a subtle warmth that made my skin crawl. I pressed my palm flat against the door, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things, but the sensation was undeniable. That night, I stayed in my old room upstairs, telling myself I was just tired and letting my imagination run wild. But sleep proved elusive, and every creak of the house sent adrenaline shooting through my system. I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the old Victorian settling, but beneath the familiar groans and sighs of aging wood, I thought I heard something else. Footsteps in the kitchen below. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs as I strained to listen. The sounds were subtle, barely perceptible above the ambient noise of the house, but they followed a pattern too regular to be random settling. Soft, measured steps moving back and forth across the linoleum floor. My mouth went completely dry, and I had to swallow several times before I could work up enough saliva to wet my lips. The logical part of my mind insisted that old houses made all kinds of noises, that I was hearing what I expected to hear rather than what was actually there, but my body knew better, flooding my system with enough adrenaline to make my hands shake and my vision blur around the edges. I forced myself to get up and investigate, though every instinct screamed at me to stay in bed and wait for morning. The hallway stretched before me like a tunnel, the darkness seeming to press in from all sides despite the moonlight filtering through the windows. Each step down the stairs felt like a betrayal of my own survival instincts. The kitchen was empty, bathed in pale silver light that made everything look ghostly and insubstantial. But the air felt different, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. I moved toward the laundry room door, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The stain was glowing. Not with visible light, but with something else. Something that my eyes could perceive but my brain couldn't process. It pulsed with a rhythm that matched my accelerated heartbeat, as if it was somehow connected to my life force. I stumbled backward, my legs suddenly weak, and had to grab the edge of the counter to keep from falling. As I watched, the stain began to change. The dark edges flickered and danced, taking on the appearance of flames once again. The shape shifted and writhed, and gradually, features began to emerge from the chaotic patterns. The suggestion of eyes, hollow and burning. The curve of a mouth twisted into that same knowing smile I remembered from my childhood. My breathing became rapid and shallow, and black spots danced at the edges of my vision. I wanted to run, to flee from the house and never return, but my legs refused to obey. I could only stand there, paralyzed by terror, as the thing in the glass regarded me with obvious amusement. Then it spoke, not with words but directly into my mind, its voice like the crackle of burning wood and the whisper of smoke through empty rooms. It told me things, revealed secrets about my family that no one else knew, about my grandfather's death, which hadn't been the heart attack everyone believed, about my grandmother's final days, when she'd spoken to empty rooms and refused to enter the kitchen after dark. The revelations came in waves, each one more disturbing than the last, until I understood that the thing in the glass had been watching, waiting, feeding on the fear and secrets of everyone who'd lived in this house. It was part of the structure now, as integral to the building as the foundation or the walls. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in that nightmarish communion. Time seemed to stretch and distort, minutes feeling like hours while hours compressed into heartbeats. But eventually, the sun began to rise, and the first pale light of dawn crept through the kitchen windows. The stain faded back to its dormant state, just a dark mark on old glass. But I knew it was still there, still watching, still waiting. The thing had shown me the truth, revealed the nature of what I'd inherited along with the house. I gathered my belongings with shaking hands and left that morning, abandoning the rest of my grandmother's possessions to gather dust for another generation. But I couldn't abandon the knowledge that had been forced into my mind, the understanding that some inheritances come with prices that can never be fully paid. The house still stands on Maple Street, waiting for the next member of my family to return. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I can feel it calling to me across the miles, reminding me that I can run, but I can never truly escape what burns in the glass of that laundry room door. The stain remains, patient and eternal, a window between worlds that someone in my bloodline will eventually have to face. Because some debts pass from generation to generation, and some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. I've moved across the country, changed my name, tried to build a new life free from the shadow of that house. But every reflection in glass makes my heart race. Every flicker of flame in my peripheral vision sends ice through my veins. Because I know the truth now, understand the terrible inheritance that waits for me in that small town where my roots run deep and dark. The thing in the glass isn't gone. It's just waiting, growing stronger with each passing year, feeding on the fear it senses across the miles. And someday, whether I want to or not, I'll have to go back. Because blood calls to blood, and debts must eventually be paid. Until then, I avoid mirrors after dark, and never look too closely at reflections in windows. Because sometimes, if the light hits the glass just right, I can see that familiar smile looking back at me, patient and eternal, reminding me that some stains can never be washed away. Story 4. Sleep had never been my sanctuary. Even as a child, the transition between consciousness and dreams felt like crossing into enemy territory, vulnerable, exposed, defenseless. But nothing had prepared me for that weekend at the old rental house, where sleep became something far worse than restless. It became a hunting ground. The farmhouse sat 3 hours outside the city, its weathered clapboard siding and sagging porch promising the kind of rustic charm that city dwellers romanticize in weekend getaways. Marcus had found it on some obscure rental site, boasting about the steal of a price and the authentic experience we'd get. Looking back, I should have questioned why a place that large was so cheap, why the photos only showed certain angles, why the owner had been so eager to rent to a group of 20-somethings with minimal questions asked. But we were young and stupid and desperate for an escape from our cramped apartments and suffocating routines. The four of us, Marcus, Jake, Danny, and myself, had been friends since college, and these quarterly getaways had become our ritual, our way of maintaining bonds that the real world seemed determined to fray. The house revealed its true nature the moment we stepped inside. The air hung thick and stale, carrying the musty sweetness of old wood and something else, something organic and wrong, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The floorboards groaned under our feet with exaggerated protest, and the windows, yellowed with age and neglect, filtered the afternoon light into a sickly amber that made everything appear slightly jaundiced. We'd planned to rough it, sharing rooms like the old days. The master bedroom went to Marcus and Jake, while Danny and I claimed the smaller room at the end of the hall. Twin beds separated by a narrow strip of worn carpet, a single window facing the dense woods that pressed against the house like curious animals. The walls bore the ghosts of old wallpaper, peeling strips hanging like dead skin, revealing patches of discolored plaster underneath. That first night, exhausted from the drive and several beers, I fell asleep easily despite the unfamiliar surroundings. But sleep in that house was different, heavier somehow, like sinking into thick mud that threatened to hold you under. My dreams were fragmented and strange, filled with the sound of footsteps that didn't belong to any of us, and voices speaking in languages I couldn't identify. I woke to Danny muttering something about the cold. The room had indeed grown frigid, our breath visible in small puffs despite the September warmth we'd left behind in the city. When I mentioned it to the others over breakfast, Marcus blamed the old heating system, and Jake suggested we'd simply left a window cracked. But I knew we'd checked everything before bed. I always checked everything. The second day brought small disturbances that nibbled at the edges of my comfort. Objects seemed to shift positions when we weren't looking. Car keys that I was certain I'd left on the kitchen counter appearing on the windowsill, Danny's phone migrating from the nightstand to the floor. When I pointed these things out, my friends offered rational explanations with the patience of people humoring a paranoid friend. We were tired, they said. Unfamiliar surroundings played tricks on the mind. But it wasn't just the objects. It was the sounds that came from within the walls. Soft scratching noises like fingernails against wood, occurring in patterns too deliberate to be settling timber or rodent activity. It was the way shadows seemed to move independently of their sources, sliding across surfaces with liquid fluidity. It was the persistent feeling of being watched, of eyes tracking our movements from places where no eyes should exist. Danny noticed it too. though he tried to hide his unease behind increasingly forced laughter and overly casual observations about how creepy old houses always had their quirks. I caught him checking locks obsessively and jumping at sounds that hadn't been there moments before. The others seemed genuinely unaffected, treating our growing paranoia as entertainment, making jokes about ghost hunters and suggesting we document everything for social media. The second night brought more vivid dreams. I found myself walking through the house in darkness, but the layout had changed. Hallways stretched longer than they should, doors opened onto rooms that didn't exist, and everywhere I turned, I glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision, quick, furtive motions that vanished the moment I tried to focus on them. I woke with my heart hammering against my ribs, my body slick with cold sweat, and the absolute certainty that I hadn't been dreaming at all. Danny's bed was empty. I found him in the kitchen, standing motionless at the window that faced the woods. His posture was wrong, too rigid, too still, like a statue of a person rather than an actual human being. When I called his name, he turned with mechanical precision, his eyes unfocused and glassy. He told me he'd been watching something moving between the trees, something that walked upright but wasn't quite human. His voice carried no emotion, as if he were discussing the weather or commenting on the coffee. The way he spoke sent ice down my spine, but when I looked outside, I saw only darkness and the vague outlines of tree trunks. I managed to convince him to return to bed, though he moved with that same eerie precision, like a marionette being guided by invisible strings. He claimed no memory of the incident the next morning, insisting he'd slept through the night without disturbance. By the third day, the house felt actively hostile. The temperature fluctuations had become extreme and localized. We'd walk from stifling heat into pockets of Arctic cold within the span of a few steps. The scratching in the walls had evolved into more complex sounds, rhythmic tapping, muffled thuds, and occasionally what sounded like whispered conversations just below the threshold of comprehension. Marcus and Jake maintained their skepticism with increasing irritation, suggesting that Danny and I were feeding off each other's paranoia and ruining the weekend for everyone. Their dismissal felt genuine, which somehow made everything worse. Either they truly couldn't perceive what Danny and I were experiencing, or something was selectively targeting us. I began documenting everything obsessively, taking photos of objects before and after their mysterious relocations, recording the strange sounds with my phone, measuring temperature variations. The evidence was always inconclusive. Shadows that looked normal in photographs, recordings that captured only silence or ordinary house noises, temperature readings that showed minimal variation. The disconnect between experience and evidence felt like gaslighting by reality itself. Sleep became increasingly elusive. I'd lie awake listening to the house breathe around us, convinced that something was moving through the walls, learning our patterns, studying our vulnerabilities. When exhaustion finally claimed me, my dreams were invaded by a presence that felt both ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting in that house far longer than we'd been alive. It was on the fourth night that everything changed. I woke not to sound but to sensation, a slow, deliberate pressure around my ankle, cold and firm like fingers made of ice and steel. My eyes snapped open, and in the dim light filtering through the grimy window, I saw it. The creature stood at the foot of my bed, its skeletal hand wrapped around my ankle with possessive certainty. It was impossibly thin, as if constructed from shadows and spider webs. Its gray skin stretched tight over a frame that suggested starvation, taken to its logical extreme. Its limbs were too long, jointed in places that defied anatomy. And its face. God. Its face was the worst part. It had eyes like black holes, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. And when it smiled, its mouth opened far wider than any human mouth should, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that gleamed wetly in the darkness. But it was the expression that paralyzed me. Pure malicious joy, like a child who'd just discovered a new toy to break. The thing began to retreat toward the door, but not in fear or haste. It moved with deliberate showmanship, like a performer taking a bow. As it reached the doorway, it began striking its back against the wooden frame in a rhythmic celebration, its too wide mouth stretched in that horrible grin, those lightless eyes never leaving mine. Thump, thump, thump. Each impact against the door frame was measured and intentional, a victory dance performed by something that had successfully completed its hunt. The sound echoed through the house with the finality of a death knell, and I understood with crystalline clarity that whatever had been stalking us through our stay had finally made its move. My body refused to obey my desperate commands to move, to scream, to do anything beyond lie there and watch as this nightmare congratulated itself on my terror. The paralysis felt complete and absolute, as if every muscle had been severed from my nervous system. I could only observe as the creature's celebration continued, its skeletal frame contorting in ways that hurt to witness. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The doorway stood empty, but the echoes of its celebration seemed to reverberate through the walls themselves, absorbed into the very structure of the house like a stain that would never fade. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting for my body to remember how to function. When sensation finally returned to my limbs, I scrambled across the room to Danny's bed, but found it empty and cold, as if it hadn't been occupied for hours. The sheets were pulled tight and undisturbed, hospital corner perfect, which made no sense because I'd watched him get into bed just hours earlier. The house around me felt different now, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more pronounced, every breath of air thick with malevolent presence. I made my way to Marcus and Jake's room, my bare feet silent on the cold floorboards, and found their door standing wide open. Their beds were empty too, sheets pulled tight in that same disturbing perfection. The entire house echoed with silence so complete it felt like being inside a tomb. I called out their names, but my voice seemed to be absorbed by the walls before it could travel more than a few feet. I searched every room, every closet, every possible hiding place, but found no trace of my friends. Their belongings remained untouched, their car keys still on the kitchen counter, their phones charging by their beds. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only the artifacts of their presence like archaeological evidence of a vanished civilization. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. They'd gone for an early morning walk. They'd driven to town for supplies. They were playing an elaborate prank. But my body knew better. My hands shook with fine tremors that I couldn't control. My breath came in short, sharp gasps that never seemed to provide enough oxygen, and my heart hammered against my ribs like a caged animal desperate for escape. I tried to leave, but the car wouldn't start. The engine turned over but caught nothing, as if some essential component had been removed or damaged. My phone showed no signal, the screen flickering with static whenever I tried to make a call. The landline we'd noticed on the kitchen wall produced only dead silence when I lifted the receiver. The house had become a prison, and I was its sole remaining occupant. Or so I thought. As the day wore on, I began to notice signs that I wasn't alone. Sounds came from rooms I'd just searched. Footsteps on the floor above, doors closing in distant parts of the house. The soft murmur of voices just below the threshold of understanding. When I investigated, I found nothing, but the sounds continued, always just out of reach, always suggesting presence without providing proof. I barricaded myself in the living room as evening approached, pushing furniture against the doors and windows with desperate strength I didn't know I possessed. But barriers meant nothing to whatever lived in that house. The sounds grew closer, more distinct, and I began to recognize voices among the whispers. Marcus laughing at something just beyond my hearing, Jake discussing plans for tomorrow, Danny commenting on the strange dreams he'd been having. They were there, somewhere in the house with me, but changed somehow, transformed into something that retained their voices but had lost their essence. The realization hit me like physical blow. The creature I'd seen hadn't been hunting us. It had been recruiting us. As night fell and the familiar sounds of the house's nocturnal awakening began, I understood that my choice was simple. I could resist and slowly lose my sanity as reality bent and twisted around me, or I could surrender and join whatever my friends had become. The gray creature appeared in the doorway as if summoned by my thoughts. its skeletal frame outlined against the darkness of the hallway. It didn't approach this time, didn't try to touch me or threaten me. It simply stood there, waiting, its too wide mouth curved in that predatory smile, its black hole eyes reflecting my terror back at me. Behind it, I could see the shadows of my friends, their familiar silhouettes distorted but recognizable. They were beckoning to me, their voices calling my name with the warmth and affection I remembered, but underneath the familiarity was something else, something hungry and inhuman that wore their faces like masks. I realized then that the gray creature's celebration hadn't been about catching me. It had been about completing its collection, about adding the final piece to some horrible puzzle that it had been assembling for far longer than I could comprehend. The thing that had been Marcus stepped forward, its voice carrying the exact intonation and cadence I remembered, speaking about how wonderful it was here, how free they all felt, how I should stop fighting and join them. But its eyes were the same lightless voids as the gray creatures, and when it smiled, I saw those same needle-sharp teeth gleaming in the darkness. I don't remember making the decision to run. One moment I was staring into those familiar yet alien faces, and the next I was crashing through the barricaded window, glass shards cutting my arms and face as I tumbled onto the porch. The woods beckoned with promise of escape, but I could hear them following, not running, but walking with measured steps, confident in their ability to find me no matter where I hid. I ran through the darkness, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, my bare feet finding every sharp stone and twisted root in my path. Behind me, their voices called my name with patient persistence, never growing distant, never fading, as if the forest itself was carrying their words to my ears. I don't know how long I ran or how I finally found the road. When the headlights of a passing truck caught me in their glare, I must have looked like something from a nightmare, blood-covered, wild-eyed, stumbling along the asphalt in torn pajamas. The driver took me to the nearest hospital, where I spent 3 days under observation while police investigated my story. They found the house empty and undisturbed. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, no trace of my friends except for their belongings, which remained exactly where they'd been left. The official report concluded that Marcus, Jake, and Danny had abandoned me after some kind of prank gone wrong, though it couldn't explain why they'd left their wallets, phones, and car behind. I know better. Sometimes in the space between sleep and waking, I can still hear their voices calling my name. They sound so much like my friends that I almost answer, almost give in to the temptation to join them in whatever they've become. But then I remember the gray creature's celebration, the way it struck its back against the doorframe in triumphant rhythm, and I force myself fully awake. The house still stands according to property records. It's been rented dozens of times since our visit, always to groups of friends looking for a weekend escape, always at that same impossibly low price. I've tried to warn people, tried to contact rental sites and local authorities, but my reputation as someone who abandoned his friends and suffered a psychotic break makes my warnings easy to dismiss. I live alone now, in a studio apartment on the 10th floor of a building where every wall is shared with neighbors, where I'm never truly isolated, never completely alone. I check locks obsessively and sleep with every light in the apartment burning bright. I've developed rituals and safeguards, ways to anchor myself to reality when the whispers start. But they're getting stronger, more insistent. And sometimes, in the reflection of my bathroom mirror or the dark surface of my television screen, I catch glimpses of movement that shouldn't be there, skeletal figures dancing in celebration, and familiar faces watching me with eyes like black holes, waiting for the moment when my defenses finally crumble. The gray creature got what it wanted that night. It collected my friends and added them to its menagerie of willing servants. But it left me behind for a reason, and I'm beginning to understand what that reason might be. I'm not the one who got away. I'm the bait for the next group. Story 5. Some streets swallow sound differently after dark. Maple Avenue was one of those streets. the kind where footsteps echoed too long and shadows seemed to breathe with a life of their own. I'd walked this route every evening for 3 months, yet tonight felt different. The air hung thick with the promise of something wrong, something that made my skin crawl before I even understood why. The routine had become sacred to me. Every day at exactly 6:15, I'd leave the office and take the long way home down Maple Avenue. It wasn't the fastest route. That would have been the main road with its honking traffic and fluorescent-lit storefronts. But I preferred the quiet residential stretch, the rows of modest houses with their small front yards and the kind of silence that let me decompress from another day of corporate numbness. That's where I first noticed him. The house sat third from the corner, distinguished by nothing except its ordinariness. Faded blue siding, a chain-link fence that had seen better decades, and a side window that faced directly onto the sidewalk. Through that window, every single evening, I could see him washing dishes. At first, it seemed unremarkable. A middle-aged man in a gray shirt, standing at what must have been his kitchen sink, methodically scrubbing plates and cups. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic. Lift the dish, scrub in circular motions, rinse, place in the drying rack. The same sequence performed with the dedication of a monk at prayer. I found myself looking forward to seeing him. There was something oddly comforting about the consistency, the proof that somewhere in this chaotic world, someone maintained their small corner of order. Week after week, as autumn deepened into early winter, he was always there, always washing, always following the same mechanical pattern. But gradually, I began to notice things that made my steps slow as I approached his window. The first peculiarity was the timing. No matter what time I walked by, whether I left work early at 5:30 or stayed late until 7, he was always washing dishes. Always in the middle of his routine, never beginning, never finishing. It struck me as odd that anyone would have such a perfectly timed schedule, or that anyone would have quite so many dishes to wash on a daily basis. The second thing I noticed was his posture. He never looked up, never glanced around, never exhibited any of the small, unconscious movements people make when they think they're alone. His focus on the dishes was absolute, unwavering, almost supernatural in its intensity. I'd seen people concentrate before, but this was different. This was the kind of focus that suggested nothing else in the world existed. Then came the evening when I realized he was always washing the same plate. I'd slowed my pace without thinking about it, drawn by some instinct I couldn't name. The streetlight cast just enough illumination through his window for me to see the dish in his hands, a white ceramic plate with a thin blue border. As I watched, he scrubbed it with the same circular motions, lifted it to inspect it, then returned it to the soapy water to begin again. The same plate, the same motions, over and over. My heart began beating faster than it should have. There was something deeply wrong about watching someone trapped in such a perfect loop, something that made my mouth go dry and my palms sweat. I forced myself to keep walking, but the image burned in my mind for the rest of the evening. The next night, I told myself I wouldn't look. I'd walk past quickly, eyes straight ahead, and put the strange man out of my thoughts entirely. But as I approached the house, my gaze was drawn to the window like iron to a magnet. He was there, of course, still washing, still focused with that unsettling intensity. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, he was smiling. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the kind of expression that looked more like a grimace stretched across his face, all teeth and no warmth. His lips were pulled back far enough to show his gums, and his eyes, what I could see of them in profile, seemed too wide, too bright. He scrubbed the plate with the same mechanical motions, but that horrible smile never wavered. I actually stumbled on the sidewalk, and had to catch myself against a telephone pole. My hands were shaking as I pressed my palms against the cold metal, trying to steady myself. When I looked back at the window, his head had turned slightly in my direction. Not fully, not enough to see me clearly, but enough that I could make out more of that twisted smile, enough to see that his eyes were indeed too wide, too bright, too focused. He wasn't looking at me, not exactly, but he was aware of my presence in a way that made every nerve in my body scream at me to run. Instead, I walked. Quickly. My breathing had become shallow and rapid, each exhale forming small clouds in the cold air. Behind me, I could feel his attention like a weight between my shoulder blades, heavy and warm and completely wrong. For the next few days, I took a different route home, but avoidance only made the obsession worse. I found myself thinking about him during meetings, during lunch, during the commute to work. The image of that smile haunted me, and worse than that was the growing certainty that I'd somehow become part of his routine, just as he'd become part of mine. The thought made me feel sick, dizzy with a fear I couldn't rationally explain. When I finally returned to Maple Avenue, it was almost a week later. I told myself I needed to prove that my imagination had run away with me, that I'd blown a perfectly innocent situation out of proportion. People smiled while doing household chores all the time. There was nothing sinister about washing dishes, no matter how many times someone might scrub the same plate. But as I approached his house, my body betrayed me. My heart rate spiked, my palms grew slick with sweat, and my mouth became so dry I could barely swallow. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to turn around, to run, to never come down this street again. He was there. Of course he was there. But tonight, the smile was gone. Tonight his head was turned toward the window, toward me, and his eyes were locked on mine with an intensity that made my vision blur around the edges. He wasn't washing anymore. The plate hung forgotten in his hands, dripping soapy water onto what must have been his kitchen floor. His entire body was oriented toward the window, toward me, and his mouth was moving. I couldn't hear what he was saying through the glass, but I could see his lips forming words. Over and over, the same phrase repeated with increasing urgency. His eyes never left mine, never blinked, never showed any recognition of me as a human being rather than an object of fascination. My legs felt like water. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I could only stand there, frozen on the sidewalk, watching him mouth his silent words while his stare burned into me like acid. Time seemed to stretch and distort, seconds feeling like hours, until finally, I managed to force my feet to move. I walked past his house quickly, my entire body shaking with adrenaline and terror. But I could feel him watching me go, could sense his attention following me down the street like a searchlight. When I finally reached the corner and turned onto the main road, I allowed myself to look back. He was no longer at the window. The kitchen appeared empty, just a sink full of soapy water catching the reflection of the streetlight. But somehow, that was worse than seeing him there. Where had he gone? What was he doing? Was he still watching me from somewhere I couldn't see? I ran the rest of the way home. That night, I barely slept. Every shadow in my apartment seemed to move. Every creak of the building settling sounded like footsteps. I kept thinking about his eyes, about the way they'd locked onto mine with such predatory focus. I'd felt like prey, like something being studied and evaluated by a predator deciding when to strike. The next evening I took a taxi home, and the evening after that. For almost 2 weeks I avoided Maple Avenue entirely, taking various routes that added time and money to my commute but kept me away from that house, away from him. But avoidance wasn't sustainable. The taxi rides were expensive, and the alternative routes took me through parts of the city I liked even less than I'd grown to fear Maple Avenue. Eventually, reluctantly, I convinced myself that I was being ridiculous. The man was probably harmless, probably didn't even remember seeing me. My imagination had inflated a few uncomfortable moments into something far more sinister than reality warranted. So on a Thursday evening in late November, as the sun was beginning its early winter descent toward the horizon, I found myself walking down Maple Avenue again. The streetlights had just flickered on, casting their harsh yellow glow across the pavement. The air was cold enough to make my breath visible, and dead leaves crunched under my feet with each step. Everything felt normal, almost anticlimactically so. Just a quiet residential street in the early evening, nothing more threatening than the approach of winter. His house came into view, and I steeled myself to look at the window as I passed. I would glance quickly, confirm that he was just a normal person doing normal things, and put this entire episode behind me once and for all. But the window was dark. No light from the kitchen, no figure at the sink. just blackness beyond the glass, empty and somehow ominous. I slowed my pace without meaning to, trying to peer more carefully into the darkness. Had he moved? Changed his routine? Was he even still living there? As I drew closer, I could make out shapes in the dim interior. The sink was there, and what looked like a drying rack beside it. But no dishes, no soap, no sign that anyone had washed anything in that kitchen for a very long time. I was almost directly in front of the house when I saw him. Not in the kitchen window. In the front yard. He was standing beside the chain-link fence, maybe 10 feet from the sidewalk, perfectly still in the gathering darkness. How long had he been there? How had I not seen him until this moment? The streetlight cast strange shadows across his face, making his features difficult to read, but I could see his eyes. Those same wide, bright eyes, fixed on me with unwavering intensity. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. He was holding something in his hands, something white and round. The plate. The same plate I'd watched him wash obsessively for months. But he wasn't washing it now. He was just holding it, gripping it with both hands like it was precious, like it was the most important thing in the world. We stared at each other across the small distance between us. Him standing motionless in his yard, me frozen on the sidewalk like a deer caught in headlights. The silence stretched between us, thick and oppressive, filled with a tension that made my skin crawl and my heart hammer against my ribs. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised the plate above his head. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. I watched him hold the dish high for a moment that felt like eternity, his eyes never leaving mine. Then, with sudden violent motion, he hurled it down onto the ground. The sound of ceramic shattering was impossibly loud in the quiet evening air. The plate exploded into fragments that scattered across the dead grass of his yard, white shards catching the streetlight like broken teeth. But even as the echoes of the crash faded, he didn't look down at the destruction. He kept staring at me, and now he was smiling again. That same horrible smile, all teeth and no warmth. That's when he started moving toward me. Not running, not walking. Something in between, a strange loping gait that covered ground faster than it should have. His arms swung at his sides with mechanical precision, and his smile never wavered, never changed. He moved with the inexorable purpose of a machine, and his eyes stayed locked on mine with every step. "Boys don't smile at strangers," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between us. The words were spoken in a sing-song tone, like a nursery rhyme or a children's game. Boys don't smile at strangers. Boys don't smile at strangers. Terror hit me like a physical blow. My entire body convulsed with adrenaline. My vision tunneling until all I could see was him approaching. All I could hear was that horrible chant repeated over and over. My legs finally remembered how to work, and I ran. But he followed. I could hear his footsteps behind me, maintaining that same unnatural rhythm. Not quite running, but covering ground with frightening efficiency. His voice continued to carry through the night air, that sing-song chant growing louder as he pursued me. Boys don't smile at strangers. Boys don't smile at strangers. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror drove me forward with inhuman energy. The sound of his pursuit seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the houses around us, filling the night with menace. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare slow down, didn't dare do anything but run toward the lights and safety of the main avenue. Behind me, his chanting grew more frenzied, more urgent. The words began to blur together into a stream of sound that was barely human, a noise that belonged in nightmares rather than reality. I could hear his breathing now, harsh and rhythmic, seeming to gain on me with every step. The intersection with the main avenue appeared ahead, blessed with traffic lights and passing cars and all the wonderful normalcy of urban life. I sprinted toward it with the last of my strength, my body screaming in protest, but my mind focused only on reaching safety, on escaping whatever madness had been unleashed behind me. I burst onto the main avenue and immediately began waving at passing cars, my voice hoarse as I tried to call for help. Several vehicles slowed, their drivers looking concerned, And finally, a taxi pulled over. I threw myself into the back seat, gasping instructions to the driver to take me anywhere but here. As we pulled away from the curb, I finally allowed myself to look back. Maple Avenue was empty. No sign of pursuit, no figure chasing after me. Just a quiet residential street bathed in the yellow glow of streetlights, as peaceful and ordinary as any other. But I knew what I'd experienced. I knew what I'd heard. Boys don't smile at strangers. The words echoed in my mind during the taxi ride, during the sleepless night that followed, during every quiet moment for weeks afterward. I never returned to Maple Avenue. I found a new route home that added 20 minutes to my commute, and I stuck to well-lit streets with plenty of pedestrian traffic. Sometimes late at night, I wonder if he's still there. Still in that house, standing in his yard, waiting for the next person to walk by. Still holding broken pieces of ceramic plates. Still smiling that horrible smile. Still chanting his strange warning about boys and strangers, and the dangers of simple human acknowledgement. I wonder, too, about the meaning of his words. Had I smiled at him during those weeks of observation? Had some unconscious expression of interest or curiosity triggered his fixation? Or was his madness deeper than that, rooted in something that had nothing to do with me at all? The questions haunt me, but not as much as the certainty that I'd glimpsed something fundamentally wrong with the world that night. Something that lurked beneath the surface of ordinary life, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Something that could transform a simple evening walk into a nightmare that would follow me for the rest of my life. I don't walk down quiet residential streets anymore. I stick to main roads, to places with crowds and noise, and the comforting chaos of normal human activity. Because now I know that somewhere out there, in houses that look perfectly innocent from the outside, there are people washing the same plate over and over again, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to care, waiting to remind us all that boys, men, should never, ever smile at strangers. Story 6. The sound of wood against wood had become the metronome of my sleepless nights, a rhythmic creaking that seemed to count down to something I couldn't name, but felt approaching with each passing hour. I first noticed Mr. Garrison 3 weeks after moving into the small rental house on Elm Street. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where retirees tended their gardens and young families walked their dogs at predictable hours. My bedroom window faced his backyard, and from my second-floor vantage point, I could see directly into his screened porch where he spent his evenings. At first, it seemed innocent enough. An elderly man in his rocking chair, probably enjoying the cool evening air. But as the days passed, I began to realize that his chair faced my window with an uncomfortable precision. Even in the darkness, I could make out his silhouette, motionless except for that steady rocking motion that continued well past midnight. The first time I noticed him watching, my pulse quickened in that instinctive way that signals danger before the mind catches up. I was changing for bed when I felt eyes on me. When I glanced toward his porch, there he was, a dark figure in that chair, and though I couldn't see his face in the shadows, I knew with certainty that he was looking directly at me. My hands trembled as I quickly pulled the curtains closed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sleep became elusive. Every night, I'd lie in bed listening to that rhythmic creaking, knowing he was out there in the darkness, watching my window even through the drawn curtains. The sound seemed to penetrate the walls, echoing in my skull until I'd press my pillow over my head, desperate for silence. But even then, I could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. I started timing his vigil. He'd appear around sunset and remain until the early hours of morning, never varying his routine. The rocking never stopped, not for bathroom breaks, not for meals, not for anything. It was as if he'd become part of the chair itself, fused into an eternal state of observation. During the day, I'd catch glimpses of him through my kitchen window as he tended his garden. He moved normally then, an ordinary old man with stooped shoulders and thin white hair. But something about his movement seemed calculated, performed. He'd glance up at my house frequently, as if checking to see if I was watching him watch me. My throat felt constantly dry, and I found myself checking the locks on my doors multiple times each night. The sensation of being observed had seeped into every corner of my existence. Even during daylight hours, when logic told me he couldn't possibly see through my walls, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I considered approaching him, asking him directly about his nighttime routine, but something primal in my gut warned against it. There was something wrong about the whole situation, something that made my skin crawl whenever I thought about walking up to his front door and confronting him. The first stone appeared on a Tuesday night in late October. I was lying awake, as had become my custom, listening to the incessant creaking when I heard a sharp tap against my bedroom window. My entire body went rigid, every muscle tense with fight or flight response. The sound came again, tap, 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 like fingers drumming against the glass. My mouth went dry as cotton. I forced myself to get up, my legs unsteady, and peer through a gap in the curtains. The porch was empty. The rocking chair sat motionless for the first time in weeks. At my feet, I found a smooth river stone, about the size of a golf ball. Scratched into its surface in crude, jagged letters were the words, "I see you." My hand shook so violently I nearly dropped the stone. The scratches looked fresh, made with something sharp and deliberate. I stood there in my darkened bedroom, holding this message from my watcher, and felt my reality shift slightly off its axis. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound, convinced I could hear footsteps in my yard. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the old house's settling felt like an intrusion. The second stone came 3 nights later. This time I was ready, having spent the intervening days in a state of hypervigilance that left me exhausted and jittery. When I heard the tap against the window, I was already dressed and waiting. I rushed to look outside, but again, the porch was empty. The message on this stone read, "Watching you sleep." My stomach lurched. The idea that he could see me sleeping, vulnerable and unaware, made bile rise in my throat. I installed blackout curtains the next day, heavy fabric that blocked every trace of light. But the stones kept coming. "You smell like fear. Your heart beats loud. Dreams taste sweet." Each message became more personal, more invasive. The scratches on the stones looked deeper, more violent. I started sleeping on the couch downstairs, as far from that window as possible. But it didn't matter. He knew exactly where I was. The messages began appearing during the day. I'd find stones in my mailbox, tucked under my car's windshield wipers, even balanced on my front door handle. How he managed this without me seeing him, I couldn't fathom. I'd taken to watching his house obsessively, but he maintained his normal daytime routine of gardening and puttering around his yard. Skin looked soft, want to touch. Soon, I called the police after the 10th stone. The officer who responded was young and looked skeptical as I explained the situation. He examined a few of the stones, took notes with obvious reluctance, and told me there wasn't much they could do unless I caught the person in the act. When I insisted it was my neighbor, he promised to drive by and check on things, but his tone suggested he thought I was dealing with teenage pranksters, or worse, my own imagination. That night, I positioned myself by the living room window with a view of Garrison's porch. I was determined to catch him in the act, to have proof of what was happening. I sat there for hours, watching that empty rocking chair, my eyes burning from strain. Around 2 a.m, I saw movement. But it wasn't Garrison getting up from his chair. The chair itself began to rock. Slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, as if someone invisible was sitting in it. The creaking resumed its familiar rhythm, but the chair appeared completely empty. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was hallucinating from exhaustion. But when I looked again, the chair continued its ghostly rocking. And somehow, impossibly, I could feel eyes watching me through my living room window. I stumbled backward, my breathing coming in sharp, painful gasps. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that I was losing my grip on reality. But my body knew better. Every primal instinct told me I was in the presence of something deeply wrong. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps on the gravel path between our houses. I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding so hard I was sure it would burst. The footsteps circled my house once, twice, 3 times. Then they stopped directly beneath my bedroom window. A new stone struck the glass above me with enough force to make me flinch. Then another, and another. A steady rain of stones, each one carrying a message I was too terrified to read. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bathroom, the only room in the house without exterior windows. My whole body shook with uncontrollable tremors, and my teeth chattered despite the warm October air. By morning, 17 stones were scattered across my bedroom floor. The messages had changed. Instead of threats or observations, they now carried instructions. Come outside. Meet me. Time to play. Don't be afraid. I'm waiting. I packed a bag that morning and checked into a motel across town. But distance brought no relief. The stones found me there too. The desk clerk looked puzzled when I asked him about them, claiming no one had been to my room. Yet there they were on my nightstand when I returned from dinner. Can't run. I follow. Always watching. I drove back to my house the next morning, defeated and desperate. I needed to end this, whatever it was. The alternative was losing my mind completely. I'd stopped eating, stopped sleeping properly. My hands shook constantly, and I jumped at every shadow. Garrison's house looked normal in the daylight. His garden was well tended, his windows clean, his porch swept. I forced myself to walk up to his front door, my legs weak with terror but my resolve firm. I needed answers. I knocked and waited. No response. I knocked again, harder this time, and called out his name. Still nothing. I tried the door handle and found it unlocked. The house smelled of decay and old newspapers. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through dirty windows. I called out again, my voice echoing in the empty rooms. No one answered. I found him in the back bedroom, in a hospital bed that hadn't been there when I'd observed the house from outside. Garrison lay motionless under a thin white sheet, his skin gray and waxy. Tubes ran from his nose and mouth to machines that had long since stopped humming. According to the medical chart at the foot of his bed, he'd been in a vegetative state for 6 months. My legs gave out. I sank into the chair beside his bed, my mind reeling. If Garrison had been catatonic for 6 months, then who had been sitting in that rocking chair? Who had been throwing stones with those disturbing messages? That's when I noticed the stones. They covered every surface in the room. The nightstand, the dresser, the windowsill, even scattered across the floor. Hundreds of them, each one scratched with the same jagged handwriting I'd come to dread. But these messages were different. Help me. Trapped. Can't wake up. So cold. Please. The room suddenly felt frigid, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The machines beside Garrison's bed flickered to life for a moment, displaying vital signs before going dark again. His eyes opened. They fixed on me with desperate intensity, and his mouth moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. He was trying to tell me something, to warn me about something. The stones around the room began to vibrate, creating a low humming sound that seemed to come from inside my head. Then I understood. Garrison wasn't throwing the stones. Something else was. Something that had been feeding off his catatonic state, using his helpless body as an anchor to this world. And now it had noticed me noticing it. The temperature in the room plummeted further. The stones began to move on their own, sliding across surfaces and gathering in the center of the room. They arranged themselves into patterns, forming letters, spelling out a message that made my blood freeze. Your turn now. I ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, bursting through the front door and not stopping until I reached my car. But as I fumbled with my keys, I could feel it following me, that presence that had been masquerading as my neighbor's attention. The stones started again that night, but now I understood their true nature. They weren't threats from a perverted old man. They were cries for help from someone trapped in a nightmare, and warnings about something ancient and hungry that had found a new target. I left town the next morning and never returned. But sometimes, in hotels and apartments hundreds of miles away, I still find stones on my windowsill. The messages have changed again. Still watching. Getting closer. Found you. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I can hear the distant sound of a rocking chair creaking with patient, eternal rhythm as something waits for me to finally stop running and come home. Story 7. The red light blinked once in the darkness above my washing machine, and I knew my life would never feel safe again. It started on a Tuesday night when the fluorescent lights in the basement laundry room flickered and died, leaving me to finish my wash cycle in the pale glow from the hallway. The building superintendent had promised to fix them weeks ago, but like everything else in this rundown complex, promises meant nothing. I was fumbling with my phone's flashlight, trying to transfer wet clothes to the dryer, when something caught my eye in the corner where the ceiling met the wall. A small rectangular device no bigger than a deck of cards sat perched on the exposed beam directly above my usual machine. A tiny red LED pulsed rhythmically in the gloom, casting an eerie crimson glow across the concrete walls. My hands froze mid-motion, a soaked t-shirt dripping steadily onto my shoes. The device was pointed directly down at my washing machine. Machine number 7, the one I'd been using exclusively for the past 6 months since moving into apartment 3B. My throat constricted as I realized I'd been doing laundry in complete darkness for the better part of 20 minutes, and whatever that thing was, it had been watching me the entire time. My heart began hammering against my ribs as I backed slowly toward the door, my eyes never leaving that blinking red eye. The wet clothes in my arms suddenly felt impossibly heavy, and I could hear my own ragged breathing echoing off the bare walls. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to take a closer look. The device was sleek, black, and obviously expensive, nothing like the cheap security cameras scattered around the building's common areas. This was professional-grade equipment, mounted with precision and angled with deliberate intent. Moisture beaded on my forehead despite the basement's perpetual chill, and my mouth went dry as cotton. I managed to climb onto a folding chair and examine the device more closely. There was no visible brand marking, but I could make out what looked like an infrared lens alongside the main camera. Night vision. The realization hit me like ice water in my veins. This thing could see perfectly in complete darkness. How long had it been there? How many nights had I done laundry in the dark, completely unaware that something was recording my every movement? My skin crawled at the thought of being watched, studied, documented without my knowledge or consent. The next morning, I confronted the building's property manager, a thin, nervous man named Morris, who always seemed to be sweating regardless of the temperature. He claimed complete ignorance about any unauthorized surveillance equipment, insisting that only the management company had access to install cameras. His pale eyes darted away from mine as he spoke, and his fingers twitched constantly at his sides. When I described the device's exact location and appearance, he promised to investigate immediately. But when I returned to do laundry 2 days later, the camera was still there. This time I decided to stay and observe. I positioned myself at the far end of the laundry room and waited. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate steps that seemed to hesitate between each floor. The basement door creaked open, and a figure emerged from the stairwell. It was Harold Grimsley from apartment 4C, a man I'd seen only in passing during my months in the building. He was tall and gaunt, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent lights. His dark hair was perpetually greasy, hanging in stringy curtains around his hollow cheeks. What disturbed me most were his eyes. They were too large for his face, bulging slightly, with irises so dark they were almost black. Harold moved with an odd, jerky gait as he approached the machines. He wasn't carrying any laundry. Instead, he walked directly to machine number 7 and stood there for several long minutes, staring up at the camera with an expression of intense concentration. His lips moved silently, as if he were having a conversation with the device. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew what looked like a small tablet or control device. I pressed myself deeper into the shadows, my pulse racing as I watched him interact with the screen. The camera's red light blinked faster, and I could swear I heard a faint mechanical whirring sound, like a lens adjusting its focus. Harold's face was illuminated by the tablet's glow, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. He was smiling. It wasn't a normal smile. It was the expression of someone experiencing profound satisfaction, the kind of look I'd seen on documentaries about people with dangerous obsessions. His oversized eyes reflected the tablet's light, giving him an almost reptilian appearance. When Harold finally left, I waited another 20 minutes before approaching Machine 7. My legs felt unsteady as I walked across the concrete floor, and every shadow seemed to harbor potential threats. The camera tracked my movement with a barely audible servo whir, its red eye following me like the gaze of some mechanical predator. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every small sound in the building seemed amplified. Footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing, the building's ancient plumbing groaning through the walls. I found myself checking the locks on my door repeatedly, testing the deadbolt and security chain with trembling fingers. The next evening, I encountered Harold in the hallway outside my apartment. He was just standing there when I opened my door, as if he'd been waiting. Up close, his appearance was even more unsettling. His skin had an odd, waxy quality, and his oversized eyes seemed to take in every detail of my face with uncomfortable intensity. He informed me that he was conducting an important scientific study on paranormal phenomena, specifically the manifestation of orbs in enclosed spaces. The camera, he explained, was essential equipment for documenting these supernatural occurrences. His voice was soft and measured, but there was an underlying current of excitement that made my skin crawl. According to Harold, orbs were spiritual entities that appeared as glowing spheres in photographs, visible only through specialized equipment. The basement laundry room, he claimed, was a hotspot for such activity due to the electromagnetic fields generated by the washing machines and the space's concrete construction. What made my stomach lurch was what came next. Harold reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila folder thick with photographs. With obvious pride, he began showing me image after image of the laundry room taken in complete darkness. The infrared photography revealed every detail of the space in ghostly green and white tones. And there I was. Photo after photo showed me going about my laundry routine, completely unaware of being observed. There were images of me loading clothes into the machine, folding items on the table, even one where I was bent over, sorting through my laundry basket. In every single photograph, I was rendered in that eerie infrared palette that made me look like some kind of spectral figure. Harold pointed to various spots in the images where he claimed to see orbs, small, round anomalies that he insisted were supernatural manifestations. To me, they looked like dust particles or water droplets on the lens, but his enthusiasm was palpable as he described each supposed spirit encounter. The worst part was realizing that these photos had been taken over a period of months. Harold had documented my routines, my habits, my schedule with meticulous precision. He knew exactly when I did laundry, how long I typically stayed in the basement, even which machines I preferred to use. My hands shook as I handed the photos back to him, and I could barely form words to express my discomfort with the situation. Harold seemed genuinely puzzled by my reaction, insisting that his research was purely scientific and that my presence in the images was merely incidental to his orb documentation. But there was something in his eyes when he said this, a glimmer of deception that made my chest tighten with fear. The way he lingered over certain photographs, the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth when showing me images where I was in vulnerable positions, the careful way he'd cataloged my activities, none of it felt scientific. It felt predatory. Over the following days, I became hyper-aware of Harold's presence in the building. I started noticing things I'd previously overlooked, how he always seemed to be coming or going whenever I left my apartment, the way he lingered in the lobby when I checked my mail, the soft sound of his door opening whenever I walked past his floor. My sleep became fitful and broken. I'd wake in the middle of the night with the absolute certainty that someone was watching my apartment, standing in the hallway just outside my door. The feeling was so strong that I'd creep to the peephole and peer out into the dimly lit corridor, expecting to see Harold's pale face staring back at me. During the day, paranoia crept into every aspect of my life. I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, scanning windows and doorways for signs of surveillance. The knowledge that Harold had been documenting my activities without my consent made me question what else might be watching me, what other invisible eyes might be tracking my movements. I stopped using the building's laundry facilities entirely, instead hauling my clothes to a laundromat 6 blocks away. But even there, I felt exposed and vulnerable. Every person who entered seemed suspicious. Every security camera felt like a potential threat. The simple act of washing clothes had become a source of profound anxiety. One evening, while picking up takeout from the restaurant on the ground floor of my building, I overheard Harold talking to the delivery driver. He was describing his research again, but this time his language was different. He spoke about subjects and behavioral patterns, rather than orbs and paranormal activity. He mentioned having documentation spanning several months, and expressed excitement about expanding his study to include other areas of the building. The blood drained from my face as I realized the truth. There were no orbs. There had never been any orbs. Harold's supernatural research was nothing more than an elaborate cover story for what was essentially voyeuristic surveillance. He was watching people, studying their routines, documenting their private moments, and using paranormal investigation as justification for his behavior. That night, I made the decision to confront him directly. My hands trembled as I knocked on his door, but I was determined to end this situation once and for all. When Harold answered, he seemed unsurprised to see me, as if he'd been expecting my visit. I told him that I knew his research wasn't really about paranormal phenomena, that I understood what he was actually doing with that camera. His reaction was immediate and disturbing. Rather than denying my accusations, Harold's eyes lit up with an intense, almost manic gleam. He invited me inside to see his real work. The interior of Harold's apartment was a shrine to surveillance. Every wall was covered with photographs, computer monitors, and what appeared to be floor plans of the building. Multiple cameras and electronic devices covered every available surface. There were photos of numerous residents going about their daily activities, checking mail, entering and leaving apartments, using the laundry facilities. But what made my legs nearly give out was an entire wall dedicated specifically to me. Hundreds of photographs chronicled my movements over the past several months. Images of me leaving for work, returning home, taking out garbage, checking my mailbox. Every aspect of my routine had been documented with obsessive thoroughness. Some photos appeared to have been taken from across the street, others from within the building itself. There were even what looked like telephoto shots taken through my apartment windows. Harold stood behind me as I stared at this collection, and I could hear his rapid, excited breathing. He began explaining his methodology, describing how he'd identified patterns in my behavior, predicted my schedule, even noted changes in my daily routine. His voice carried the same tone of scientific pride he'd used when discussing orbs, but now the facade was completely dropped. The room felt like it was spinning as the full scope of his surveillance became clear. This wasn't just casual observation. It was systematic stalking disguised as research. Harold had been studying me like a specimen, documenting my life with the dedication of a trained scientist. My throat constricted as I realized that Harold knew things about me that I'd never shared with anyone in the building. He knew my work schedule, my shopping habits, my social patterns. He probably knew when I slept, when I showered, when I was alone and vulnerable. As I backed toward the door, Harold continued talking, but his words became increasingly disturbing. He spoke about the importance of his work, about how people needed to be observed and understood. He mentioned other subjects he'd studied in previous buildings, other collections he'd compiled. The implication was chilling. I wasn't his first victim, and I likely wouldn't be his last. I managed to escape from Harold's apartment, but the damage was done. The knowledge that someone had been systematically documenting my life, studying my vulnerabilities, planning who knows what based on that information, left me feeling violated in a way I'd never experienced before. Sleep became impossible. Every sound in the building sent adrenaline coursing through my system. I installed additional locks on my door, covered my windows with heavy curtains, and started varying my schedule in random ways to disrupt any patterns Harold might be tracking. But the paranoia only grew worse. If Harold could watch me so extensively without my knowledge, what other threats might be lurking unseen? How many other eyes might be documenting my life? The world suddenly felt like a place where privacy was an illusion, and safety was constantly under threat. I contacted the police, but explaining the situation proved nearly impossible. Harold hadn't technically broken any laws. The camera was on his own property, and photographing someone in public areas wasn't illegal. The officers seemed more annoyed than concerned, treating my report as a neighborly dispute rather than a serious safety issue. The building management was equally unhelpful. They claimed that tenants were allowed to install security equipment as long as it didn't violate other residents' rights, and since the camera was positioned over Harold's assigned machine, they couldn't take action without more substantial evidence of wrongdoing. I was trapped, living in the same building as someone who had demonstrated a dangerous obsession with surveilling my life, with no legal recourse and no protection from authorities who didn't understand the psychological violation I'd experienced. The final straw came 2 weeks later, when I found a new envelope slipped under my door. Inside were recent photographs of me at the laundromat I'd been using, taken from across the street through the large front windows. Harold had followed me. His surveillance had expanded beyond the building, extending into the wider world. That night, I packed everything I could fit into my car and left the building permanently. I broke my lease, forfeited my security deposit, and moved across the city to a place where Harold couldn't find me. It was the only way I could regain any sense of safety. But even now, months later, I still check every corner for hidden cameras. I still scan crowds for familiar faces. I still wake up in the middle of the night with the absolute certainty that someone is watching me, documenting my movements, studying my patterns. The red light that had blinked above machine number 7 had revealed a truth more terrifying than any supernatural phenomenon, that the real monsters aren't ghosts or demons, but the people who live among us, hiding their predatory nature behind facades of normalcy and scientific curiosity. And somewhere out there, Harold is probably setting up another camera, watching another unsuspecting victim, adding new photographs to another wall of obsession. The orb watcher is still watching, still hunting for new subjects to study and document. The red light never really stops blinking. It just finds new places to hide. Story 8. The metallic stench hit me first. Copper pennies dissolved in ammonia, sharp enough to make my sinuses burn. I'd been living in this cramped apartment for 3 months, and nothing had ever smelled like that before. I found the source when I went to grab my work boots from beside the front door. A thin film of green slime coated the worn leather, glistening under the harsh fluorescent light like wet algae. My stomach lurched as I bent closer. The substance wasn't just sitting on the surface. It seemed to be growing from within the leather itself, seeping through invisible pores. My hands trembled as I reached for the boots, then jerked back. The smell intensified, metallic and organic, like blood mixed with pond scum. I forced myself to breathe through my mouth, but I could taste it now, bitter copper coating my tongue. I backed away from the boots, my heart already hammering against my ribs. That's when I noticed my bicycle propped against the far wall. The same green film covered the handlebars and seat, dripping slowly onto the linoleum floor in thick drops that made soft plopping sounds in the silence. My throat constricted. I spun around, scanning the small living space with growing panic. There, my reading chair, the old recliner I'd inherited from my grandfather. The armrests were slick with the substance, and it was spreading down the sides in slow, viscous rivulets. 3 objects. Only 3. Everything else in the apartment remained untouched. The coffee table, the TV stand, my dresser, the kitchen appliances. Just my boots, my bike, and my chair. I stumbled backward until my shoulders hit the wall, my breathing already shallow and rapid. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing inward. The fluorescent light flickered once, casting moving shadows that made the slime appear to pulse and writhe. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. I spent the next hour pacing the apartment, giving the affected objects a wide berth. My palms were slick with sweat, and I kept wiping them on my jeans, but the moisture returned immediately. The metallic smell seemed to follow me everywhere, clinging to my nostrils like a living thing. I called in sick to work. The thought of putting on those boots, of touching that green film, made my stomach churn violently. Instead, I sat on my bed, safely across the room from the contaminated furniture, and stared at the three objects, trying to find some pattern, some explanation. The slime continued to grow throughout the day. By afternoon, it had thickened noticeably, forming what looked like a crude skin over each object. When I finally worked up the courage to examine it more closely, keeping several feet away, I could see tiny bubbles forming and popping within the substance. It was alive, or at least actively changing. The smell had worsened too. Now it carried undertones of decay, like meat left too long in the sun. I opened every window in the apartment, but the odor seemed to intensify rather than dissipate. It clung to the air itself, heavy and oppressive. As evening approached, I made a decision that would haunt me for weeks to come. I had to know if the slime was somehow attached to the objects themselves or to their locations. Fighting every instinct screaming at me to run, I grabbed a pair of rubber gloves from under the kitchen sink. My hands shook so violently I could barely get the gloves on. My heart was beating so fast I felt dizzy, and cold sweat dripped down my spine despite the apartment's stuffiness. I approached the reading chair first, moving slowly like I was approaching a wild animal. The green film made wet, sucking sounds as I gripped the chair's frame, avoiding the slime-covered armrests. The substance felt warm through the rubber gloves, and I could swear I felt it pulsing, like a slow heartbeat. Bile rose in my throat, but I forced myself to drag the chair to the opposite corner of the room. What I saw when I turned around made my knees buckle. The slime hadn't moved with the chair. Instead, it remained exactly where the chair had been sitting, maintaining the perfect outline of the armrests and backrest. A phantom imprint suspended 3 feet above the floor, glowing faintly green in the dim apartment light. I staggered backward, my vision tunneling. The floating silhouette hung there like an accusation, like a wound in reality itself. The smell had become unbearable, not just metallic now, but putrid, like something fundamental had gone rotten. With mounting horror, I forced myself to move the other 2 objects. Each time, the result was the same. The slime stayed in its original position, creating perfect hollow outlines suspended in space. My bicycle's handlebars and seat hovered near the wall, dripping green ooze onto the floor below. My boots left their own ghostly impression by the door, down to the individual lace holes. I collapsed onto my bed, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. The 3 phantom shapes dominated the room now, impossible to ignore. They seemed to pulse in unison, like breathing, like something alive and watching. Sleep was impossible. I lay rigid on the mattress, staring at the floating silhouettes, listening to the slow drip of the substance onto the floor. The sound had developed a rhythm, drip, pause, like Morse code, like someone trying to communicate. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was some kind of chemical reaction, maybe something in the building's pipes or ventilation system. I would clean it up, throw away the affected items if necessary, and pretend this had never happened. But when I approached the phantom chair outline with cleaning supplies, my confidence evaporated. The green substance felt solid under the spray bottle's stream, maintaining its shape despite having nothing visible to support it. When I tried to wipe it away, the cloth passed through empty air, yet still came away stained green and reeking of metal. The phantom shapes were untouchable, unreachable, yet undeniably present. I left the apartment that day, staying at my office long after hours, sleeping on the couch in the break room. But I had to return eventually. The apartment was all I could afford, and besides, where could I go? How could I explain this to anyone? When I unlocked my door that evening, the smell hit me like a physical blow. The phantom shapes had grown larger, their green glow brighter. Worse, new details had emerged within the silhouettes. I could make out the texture of my chair's fabric, the individual spokes of my bicycle wheels, the treads on my boot soles, all suspended in thin air, all impossible. But it was the sounds that nearly broke me. The dripping had been joined by new noises, a soft squelching, like someone walking through mud, and an almost inaudible whisper that might have been wind through the walls or might have been something else entirely. I spent another sleepless night, but this time I watched the phantoms more carefully. As the hours passed, I began to notice subtle movements within the green outlines. The handlebars of my bicycle phantom seemed to turn slightly, back and forth, as if someone were steering. The chair's backrest tilted and straightened, tilted and straightened. The boots shifted weight from heel to toe. Heel to toe. They were mimicking use. Something was sitting in my chair, riding my bike, walking in my boots. Something that existed only in the space where these objects used to be. The whispers grew louder as dawn approached, forming almost words in a language I didn't recognize. The metallic smell had evolved again, now carrying notes of ozone and burnt circuitry, like the air during an electrical storm. I began to understand, with growing terror, that I was witnessing some kind of claim being made. Something had marked these three objects as its own, and moving them had only revealed the true nature of that ownership. The green slime wasn't growing on my possessions. It was replacing them, creating perfect copies that existed independent of physical reality. Days blended together in a haze of sleeplessness and growing paranoia. I stopped going to work altogether. Food lost all taste except for the persistent copper flavor that coated my tongue. I found myself speaking to the phantom shapes, asking them what they wanted, begging them to leave me alone. The whispers began to respond. I couldn't make out words, but the tone changed based on my questions. Angry hisses when I demanded answers. Soft, almost soothing sounds when I pleaded. And sometimes, late at night when exhaustion made me vulnerable, something that sounded almost like laughter. The green glow grew brighter each night, casting everything in sickly underwater light. The phantom shapes began to move more boldly, no longer content to merely mimic use. The bicycle rolled slowly across the room, its wheels spinning silently. The chair rocked back and forth with increasing vigor. The boots paced from wall to wall, leaving wet footprints that vanished moments after they appeared. I realized with crystalline clarity that cut through my mounting madness that something was learning to inhabit these spaces. Something was using my possessions as a template, figuring out how to exist in my world. The final revelation came on the seventh night, when exhaustion finally drove me to collapse. I awoke to find the phantom shapes clustered around my bed, close enough that the green glow bathed my skin in sickly light. The metallic smell was overwhelming now, so thick I could barely breathe. But it was the silence that terrified me most. No more dripping, no more whispers. Just the oppressive presence of three impossible things watching me with eyeless attention. I understood then that this had never been about my possessions. The boots, the bike, the chair, they were just the beginning. Something was mapping my life, learning my routines, studying the spaces I inhabited most. And now that it had finished its research, it was ready to expand. I left that night with nothing but the clothes on my back, abandoning the apartment and everything in it. I told myself I was running from madness, from stress-induced hallucinations brought on by too many late nights and too much caffeine. But sometimes, in quiet moments when I'm sitting in my new apartment, I catch the faint scent of metal in the air. And sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, I think I see a faint green glow where my furniture used to be. I've learned to move carefully now, to never stay in one place too long, to never develop routines. Because I know with bone-deep certainty that somewhere in an empty apartment across town, three phantom shapes are still glowing in the dark, still learning, still waiting. Story 9. The fluorescent bulb above the bathroom mirror flickered with the dying gasps of something that should have been replaced weeks ago. Each intermittent flash cast grotesque shadows that danced across the cracked tiles, transforming familiar shapes into leering faces that vanished the moment I tried to focus on them. The smell of mildew hung thick in the air, mixed with something else, something metallic and wrong that made my stomach clench with an inexplicable dread. I'd been avoiding this room for 3 days. The house had been mine for barely a month, inherited from a great aunt I'd met only twice in my life. Martha Kellaway had been what my family politely called eccentric, though the neighbors used harsher words when they thought no one was listening. She'd lived alone for 47 years in this Victorian monstrosity, speaking only to the grocery delivery boy and the priest who came monthly to take her confession. When the lawyer handed me the keys, he'd mentioned that she'd died peacefully in her sleep, but something in his eyes suggested there were details he wasn't sharing. Now, standing in the doorway of her bathroom at 3 a.m, I wondered what those details might have been. My bladder ached with the pressure that had finally driven me from my bed, despite every instinct screaming at me to hold it until morning. The main floor powder room had been my refuge since moving in, but tonight its toilet had chosen to back up, leaving me with no choice but to venture upstairs to this place that made my skin crawl. The floorboards creaked beneath my bare feet as I stepped inside, each sound seeming to echo far longer than it should in such a small space. The bathroom was cramped and outdated, with a clawfoot tub that dominated one wall and a toilet squeezed into the corner beside an old-fashioned wash basin. Everything was painted in shades of sickly green that reminded me of hospital walls, though time and moisture had turned patches into something that looked disturbingly like dried blood. I approached the toilet with the reluctance of a man walking to his execution. The seat was up, revealing a bowl filled with water so dark it looked black in the uncertain light. As I lifted the lid to relieve myself, the fluorescent bulb chose that moment to die completely, plunging the room into absolute darkness. My heart hammered against my ribs like a caged animal trying to escape. The darkness was total, oppressive, pressing against my eyeballs until I saw spots of color that weren't there. I fumbled for the light switch, my trembling fingers slapping uselessly against the wall until I found it. I flicked it up and down repeatedly, but nothing happened. That's when I heard the first sound. A wet, sliding noise came from behind the toilet, like something smooth and muscular dragging itself across the tile floor. My breath caught in my throat, and I pressed myself against the wall, my hands spread flat against the cold plaster. The sound continued, accompanied by a soft scratching that reminded me of claws on linoleum. I told myself it was just a rat. Old houses had rats. It was perfectly normal, even if the scratching sounded too deliberate, too rhythmic, like something tapping out a message in a code I didn't want to understand. My eyes began to adjust to the darkness, and I could make out vague shapes in the gloom. The toilet stood like a pale monument in the corner, and behind it, in the narrow space between the porcelain and the wall, something darker than the surrounding shadows seemed to writhe and pulse. The water tank above the toilet began to bubble, not the gentle gurgling of settling pipes, but an aggressive boiling sound, as if the water inside had suddenly reached a rolling boil. Steam began to rise from the tank, visible even in the darkness as wispy tendrils that caught what little light filtered in from the hallway. The bubbling grew louder, more violent, and the metal sides of the tank began to vibrate with a rhythmic thrumming that seemed to match the frantic beating of my heart. I wanted to run. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn and sprint back to my bedroom, to slam the door and barricade myself inside until morning. But my legs felt like they were made of lead, and my feet seemed rooted to the floor. I could only stand there, pressed against the wall, watching as something impossible unfolded before me. A flash of red caught my eye in the space behind the toilet. Not the dull red of rust or old blood, but a vibrant crimson that seemed to glow with its own inner light. It moved with a sinuous, undulating motion, disappearing and reappearing like a snake weaving through tall grass. As I stared, transfixed with horror, I realized what I was seeing. It was a tail, long and muscular, covered in what looked like wet scales that reflected the dim light from the hallway. It was easily as thick as my forearm and seemed to stretch back into the shadows farther than the cramped space should have allowed. The tip was pointed and barbed, flexing and curling with a malevolent intelligence that made my bladder release involuntarily, soaking my pajama pants with warm urine. The shame of wetting myself like a frightened child was overwhelmed by the primitive terror that flooded my system. Adrenaline surged through my veins, making my hands shake and my vision blur. My mouth went dry as sandpaper, and I could taste copper on my tongue. The room seemed to tilt and spin around me, and I had to grip the doorframe to keep from falling. The red tail continued its hypnotic dance, weaving in and out of the shadows with an almost playful malice. Whatever creature it belonged to remained hidden in the impossible darkness behind the toilet, but I could sense its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. The air grew thick and hard to breathe, filled with an oppressive humidity that made my clothes stick to my skin. Then the door began to move. Slowly, with a grinding creak that set my teeth on edge, the bathroom door swung toward the frame. The hinges protested with each inch, producing a sound like fingernails dragging across a chalkboard. I watched in paralyzed horror as my only exit began to close, the rectangle of hallway light growing narrower and narrower. I tried to move, to lunge forward and grab the door before it could shut completely, but my body refused to obey. My muscles were locked in place by terror so complete it was like being encased in concrete. All I could do was watch as the door continued its inexorable journey toward the frame, accompanied by that hellish shrieking of metal on metal. The water in the toilet tank was bubbling so violently now that the entire fixture shook with each eruption. The sound was deafening in the small space, a rolling thunder that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth itself. Steam poured from the tank in great billowing clouds, filling the room with a fog that reeked of sulfur and decay. Through the mist, I caught glimpses of the red tail as it grew more agitated, lashing back and forth with increasing violence. Whatever was attached to it was getting angry, and I had the terrible feeling that my presence had awakened something that had been sleeping peacefully until I'd disturbed its rest. The door was almost closed now, leaving only a thin sliver of light from the hallway. In desperation, I found my voice, though what came out was barely a whisper. "Please," I croaked, my throat raw and burning. "I'll do anything." The door stopped moving. The bubbling water fell silent. The red tail froze in mid-writhe, its barbed tip pointing directly at me like an accusing finger. In the sudden quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears and the rasp of my labored breathing. Sweat poured down my face and back, despite the chill that had settled over the room. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, though it could only have been seconds. Then, from the shadows behind the toilet, came a voice. It wasn't a voice in any conventional sense. It was more like thoughts being pressed directly into my brain, bypassing my ears entirely. The words formed themselves in my mind with a clarity that was somehow more terrifying than if I'd heard them spoken aloud. The voice told me what it wanted. A simple thing, really. A promise. A commitment to perform a small ritual each night before sleep, one that would acknowledge its presence and show proper respect for the ancient compact that had been made in this house long before I was born. My great-aunt had understood the terms. She'd honored them faithfully for nearly 5 decades, and in return, she'd been allowed to live in peace. The thing behind the toilet had been patient with my ignorance, but patience had its limits. It was time for me to take up the burden that came with inheriting this house. All I had to do was promise to pray before sleeping, not to any god I might have worshipped, but to the entity that dwelt in the spaces between the walls, in the shadows beneath the stairs, in the darkness behind the toilet where human eyes were not meant to look. A simple acknowledgement each night that I was not the true master of this house, merely its temporary caretaker. The words tumbled out of my mouth before I could stop them, a pledge spoken in desperate haste while my rational mind screamed at me to run instead. I promised to pray each night, to show proper reverence, to remember my place in the hierarchy of things that existed beyond human understanding. The moment the words left my lips, the red tail vanished into the shadows with a sound like silk sliding across glass. The water in the toilet tank settled into silence, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted just enough for me to draw a full breath. The door swung open with a gentle creak, revealing the blessed light of the hallway beyond. I stumbled out of the bathroom on unsteady legs, my clothes soaked with sweat and urine, my mind reeling from what I'd experienced. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been a hallucination brought on by stress and the unfamiliarity of a new home. But the smell of sulfur that clung to my hair and the taste of copper that coated my tongue told a different story. That was 6 months ago. True to my word, I pray each night before bed, not to the God of my childhood, but to the thing that watches from the shadows. I've learned its preferences over time. It likes the prayers spoken in Latin, though I don't know why. It prefers them offered at the stroke of midnight while facing the bathroom door. And it appreciates small offerings. Drops of wine poured down the drain, coins left on the windowsill, locks of hair burned in the fireplace. In return, it leaves me alone during the day. I can live my life, work my job, maintain the fiction that I'm a normal man living in a normal house. But at night, when the sun disappears and the shadows grow long, I remember the truth of what shares this space with me. The house has been in my family for 3 generations now, passed down through a line of caretakers who understood their true role. My great-aunt left behind journals, hidden in a secret compartment behind the kitchen pantry, that detail the history of the compact. She'd written about her predecessor, my great-great-uncle William, who'd made the original agreement in 1923 after a series of unexplained accidents had driven away 3 previous owners. The entity, she never named it, referring to it only as the resident, had been in the house far longer than any human occupant. William had been the first to successfully negotiate terms that allowed for coexistence rather than conquest. The arrangement had worked well for a century, with each caretaker passing the responsibility to the next generation, along with the deed to the property. But the journals also contained warnings, stories of caretakers who'd grown careless, who'd forgotten their nightly obligations or tried to break the compact. The consequences were never fatal. The residents seemed to prefer psychological torment to physical harm, but they were severe enough to drive grown men to madness or despair. I've been careful to honor every term of our agreement. My prayers are offered punctually each night at midnight, spoken in the ancient tongue with the proper inflections my great-aunt had phonetically transcribed in her careful handwriting. I've made the required offerings and observed the small rituals that keep the peace between us. Yet lately, I've begun to notice changes. The red tail appears more frequently now, not just behind the toilet, but in other shadows throughout the house. I've glimpsed it curled beneath the staircase, wrapped around the legs of the dining room table, even coiled inside my bedroom closet when I've opened the door too quickly. It never threatens, but its presence is a constant reminder of what shares this space with me. The resident has also begun to test the boundaries of our agreement in small ways. Doors that I leave open are found closed in the morning. Objects are moved from where I place them to locations with significance I don't yet understand. The temperature in certain rooms drops without warning, and I've learned to carry a sweater even in the height of summer. Most disturbing of all, I've started to hear whispers. Not the clear communication I'd experienced that first night, but faint murmurings that seem to come from inside the walls themselves. The words are unintelligible, spoken in a language that predates human speech, but the tone is unmistakable. The resident is growing restless, perhaps dissatisfied with our current arrangement. I found references in my great-aunt's later journals to similar experiences. She'd written about the whispers, the moving objects, the increasing frequency of sightings. Her final entry, dated just 2 weeks before her death, mentioned her concerns that the compact might need to be renegotiated. She'd been planning to research the original terms to see if modifications were possible. She died before she could complete that research. Now, as I sit in the living room at 11:45 in the evening, waiting for midnight to approach so I can offer my nightly prayer, I find myself wondering if her death had truly been as peaceful as the lawyer claimed. The resident had never killed a caretaker before, but that didn't mean it was incapable of doing so. The red tail slides across the hallway behind me, and I don't turn to look. I've learned that acknowledging its presence outside of the prescribed rituals only encourages more frequent appearances. Instead, I focus on the grandfather clock in the corner, watching as its hands creep inexorably toward the appointed hour. In 15 minutes, I'll climb the stairs to the bathroom. I'll stand before the mirror with its cracked surface and speak the ancient words that my great-aunt taught me through her carefully preserved notes. I'll make my offering of wine and hair, and whatever small tribute the resident seems to require. And then I'll return to my bed, to sleep fitfully until morning brings the temporary illusion of normalcy. But tonight feels different. The whispers have been louder, more insistent. The tale has appeared a dozen times since sunset, each sighting lasting longer than the last. The air itself seems charged with anticipation, as if something significant is about to occur. As the clock strikes midnight, I make my way upstairs with the slow steps of a condemned man walking to his execution. The bathroom door stands open, waiting for me, and I can see the red tail already writhing in the shadows behind the toilet. I begin to speak the words of my nightly prayer, but this time, the resident interrupts me before I can finish. The voice fills my mind with new terms, new requirements, an evolution of our compact that will demand much more than simple prayers and small offerings. And as I listen to what it wants from me now, I finally understand why my great-aunt had looked so tired in her final photographs, why her handwriting had grown increasingly shaky in her last journal entries. The compact was never meant to be permanent. It was only a temporary arrangement, a way to postpone the inevitable. And now, after a century of human caretakers, the resident is ready to reclaim what was always rightfully its own. I have a choice to make. Accept the new terms and become something more than human, or refuse and face consequences that will make my great-aunt's peaceful death seem like a mercy. The red tail coils around my ankle like a shackle, and I give my answer. Story 10. Wait, the old Victorian house had been watching me for 3 weeks, and I was finally beginning to understand that some stains never wash away. They only grow darker with time. It started with the tea. Such an innocent ritual, something I'd done thousands of times before in countless other homes. But this house was different. This house had been waiting. I'd moved into the rental property on Elm Street after my divorce was finalized, needing somewhere quiet to put the pieces of my life back together. The landlord, Mrs. Henley, had been eager to rent it out, almost suspiciously so. When I asked about the previous tenant, she'd mumbled something about him leaving suddenly for family reasons. Her eyes wouldn't meet mine when she said it. The house itself seemed ordinary enough at first glance. 3 stories of weathered brick and peeling white trim, with a narrow staircase that creaked under even the lightest footstep. The kind of place that had seen better decades, where shadows lingered a little too long in the corners, and the floorboards groaned with memories I couldn't quite identify. But it was the second-floor landing that bothered me most. There was something about that particular spot, right at the top of the stairs where the hallway bent toward the bedrooms. The plaster wall there looked different somehow, newer than the rest, as if it had been patched and repainted recently. Yet beneath the fresh coat of paint, I could sometimes make out the faintest outline of something darker underneath. For the first 2 weeks, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Stress from the divorce, from starting over, from sleeping in an unfamiliar bed surrounded by the settling sounds of an old house. I told myself that the way my skin crawled when I walked past that spot was nothing more than anxiety, manifesting in physical symptoms. But then came the night with the tea. I'd been working late in my makeshift home office on the first floor, hunched over my laptop trying to finish a freelance project that would help cover next month's rent. The caffeine from my afternoon coffee had long since worn off, leaving me sluggish and unfocused. Around midnight, I decided to make myself some chamomile tea, something to calm my nerves before attempting to sleep in this place that never quite felt like home. The kitchen was at the back of the house, separated from the front rooms by a long, dim hallway. As I waited for the water to boil, I found myself staring out the window into the backyard, where the skeletal branches of an old oak tree scratched against the glass with each gust of wind. The sound was like fingernails on a chalkboard, setting my teeth on edge. When the kettle finally whistled, I poured the steaming water over the tea bag and cradled the warm mug in both hands. The familiar ritual should have been comforting, but something felt off. The house was too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Even the usual creaking and settling had stopped completely, leaving only the muffled sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I climbed the stairs slowly, one careful step at a time. The mug was fuller than usual, and I didn't want to spill the hot liquid on the worn carpet runner. My bare feet were silent against the wood, but each step seemed to echo anyway, as if the house were amplifying every small sound I made. As I reached the second-floor landing, that familiar crawling sensation began at the base of my skull. The fine hairs on my arms stood up, and my grip tightened involuntarily around the mug's handle. The air felt thicker here, charged with an energy I couldn't name but definitely didn't want to examine too closely. I was almost past the spot, that strange patch of wall that had been bothering me for weeks, when it happened. The push came from behind and slightly to the right, a firm pressure against my shoulder blade that sent me stumbling forward. Not a gentle nudge or accidental bump, but a deliberate shove with enough force to completely destroy my balance. The mug flew from my hands, hot tea splashing in an arc across the landing as I pitched forward toward the stairs. Time seemed to slow as I fell. I remember the sensation of weightlessness, the sick feeling in my stomach as gravity took hold. My hands shot out instinctively, trying to find purchase on something, anything, to stop my tumble down the narrow staircase. My shoulder hit the wall, then my hip connected with the edge of a step, sending shock waves of pain through my body. I rolled and bounced down what felt like every single one of those 17 steps, my body a collection of sharp angles and vulnerable joints colliding with unforgiving wood. By the time I came to rest at the bottom, sprawled on the first floor landing like a broken marionette, my entire body was singing with pain. For several minutes, I just lay there, taking inventory. My left wrist throbbed, possibly sprained. My right shoulder felt like it had been hit with a baseball bat. There would be bruises covering most of my torso by morning, but nothing seemed broken, nothing that wouldn't heal with time and ibuprofen. The rational part of my mind immediately began searching for explanations. I'd been tired, distracted by work stress. My feet had been bare, making it easy to slip on the smooth wood. The mug had been fuller than usual, throwing off my balance. Maybe I'd caught my toe on the carpet runner, or misjudged the distance to the next step. But even as I ran through these perfectly reasonable possibilities, my heart was hammering against my ribs with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the physical trauma of the fall. Because I knew, with the same certainty that I knew my own name, that something had pushed me. I had felt it, a distinct pressure against my shoulder, applied with intention and force. I managed to pull myself to my feet, wincing as my bruised muscles protested. The broken mug lay scattered across the landing in sharp white fragments, dark tea stains spreading across the faded carpet like spilled blood. I would deal with the mess in the morning, when my hands weren't shaking quite so badly. But first I had to look. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to go to bed, to ice my injuries and pretend this had been nothing more than a clumsy accident. But something compelled me to climb those stairs again, to examine the spot where I'd felt that push. Each step up was agony. My body had already begun to stiffen, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. But I pressed on, driven by a need I couldn't articulate, until I was standing once again on the second floor landing. The hallway was darker now, lit only by the weak glow from a streetlight filtering through the window at the far end. I fumbled along the wall until I found the light switch, and fluorescent bulbs flickered to life overhead, casting everything in harsh, clinical brightness. That's when I saw it. On the wall, exactly where I had felt that push against my shoulder, there was a stain. Not the faint outline I'd been noticing for weeks, but a distinct, oval-shaped mark that was so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. It was roughly the size of a human handprint, maybe slightly larger, and it appeared to be seeping through the paint like oil through paper. My mouth went dry. The mark hadn't been there before. I was certain of it. I'd walked past this spot dozens of times, and while I'd always felt uneasy here, I'd never seen anything like this. The stain was fresh, still wet-looking around the edges, as if whatever had caused it was still actively bleeding through from the other side of the wall. I reached out with a trembling hand, then stopped myself just short of touching it. Something about the mark made my skin crawl, made every nerve ending in my body fire off warning signals. It looked wrong somehow, not like any stain I'd ever seen before. The darkness wasn't uniform. It seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision, though it remained perfectly still when I looked at it directly. I backed away from the wall, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My rational mind was still trying to provide explanations. A water leak, old paint bleeding through, some kind of chemical reaction caused by humidity or temperature changes. But my body knew better. My body was already flooding with adrenaline, preparing for fight or flight, responding to a threat my conscious mind couldn't yet accept. I spent the rest of that night in the living room, huddled on the couch with every light in the house blazing. Every small sound made me jump. The whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant rumble of a late-night truck, the soft settling of old wood. But underneath it all was something else, a presence that seemed to press against the edges of my awareness, like a half-remembered nightmare. When morning finally came, I convinced myself that exhaustion and stress had made me see things that weren't there. In the harsh light of day, surely the wall would look normal again. The stain would reveal itself to be nothing more than a trick of shadows and fluorescent lighting. But it was still there. If anything, it looked worse in the daylight. The oval shape was more defined now, with crisp edges that seemed almost burned into the plaster. The color was wrong too, not brown or black like a water stain, but a deep, oily purple that seemed to have its own depth. Looking at it made my eyes water, as if my brain couldn't quite process what it was seeing. I called Mrs. Henley, trying to keep my voice steady as I described a water stain that had appeared overnight. She listened in silence, then promised to send someone to look at it later in the week. Her tone was carefully neutral, but I caught something underneath. Not surprise, but resignation, as if she'd been expecting this call. The handyman arrived 3 days later, a weathered man in his 60s who introduced himself only as Pete. He took one look at the stain and his face went pale. He ran his hands along the wall, checking for moisture, temperature changes, anything that might explain the mark. He found nothing. Pete told me he'd need to cut into the wall to see what was behind it, to check for pipe damage or structural issues. I gave him permission, desperate for any explanation that would make sense of what I was seeing. When his utility knife bit into the plaster around the stain, the smell hit us both immediately. It was like rotting vegetation mixed with something metallic and sharp, the smell of things that had been buried too long in wet earth. Pete jerked back, his hand over his nose and mouth, but it was what we saw inside the wall that made us both step back in horror. The space between the studs was filled with a dark, viscous substance that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. It wasn't water damage or mold. It was something organic, something that moved with purpose. As we watched, frozen in shock, the substance began to seep through the opening Pete had made, oozing down the wall in thick, dark rivulets. Pete was already packing up his tools, his hands shaking as he threw everything into his toolbox. He mumbled something about calling Mrs. Henley, about needing to contact someone else, someone who dealt with this kind of thing. He wouldn't meet my eyes as he left, and I noticed he made the sign of the cross as he hurried down the front steps. I was alone with it now. This thing that lived in my walls, that had pushed me down the stairs and left its mark for me to find. The stain was growing larger by the hour, spreading across the white paint like an infection. And sometimes, when the house was very quiet, I could swear I heard it breathing. Mrs. Henley never returned my calls after that. Pete never came back to finish the job. I tried covering the hole with plastic sheeting, but whatever was behind the wall ate through it within hours. I tried painting over the stain, but the darkness bled through every coat like it was feeding on the paint itself. That was 2 weeks ago. Now, as I sit here in the living room with my bags packed and my car keys in my hand, I can hear it moving up there. Not just behind the wall anymore, but in the wall, through the wall, becoming part of the very structure of the house. The stain has spread to cover most of the landing now, and tendrils of that impossible darkness are creeping down the hallway toward the bedrooms. I understand now why the previous tenant left so suddenly. I understand why Mrs. Henley was so eager to rent the place out, why she wouldn't meet my eyes when I asked about the history of the house. This thing, whatever it is, doesn't just live here, it feeds here. It feeds on the people who are unlucky enough to call this place home. But I'm leaving now, before it can feed on me. The moving truck will be here in an hour to collect my belongings. I'll forfeit my security deposit, break my lease, do whatever it takes to get out of this place. Because I know, with the same certainty that I knew someone had pushed me down those stairs, that if I stay much longer, I'll become part of whatever darkness lives behind these walls. As I write this, I can see the stain beginning to appear on the ceiling above me, seeping through from the floor above like spilled ink. It knows I'm leaving. It knows I've figured out what it is. And it's reaching for me with tendrils of darkness that smell like graves and taste like despair. The truck should be here any minute now. I hope I can hold out that long. Story 11. The stained glass windows of our grandmother's Victorian house had always possessed an unsettling quality, their kaleidoscope fragments catching light in ways that seemed to breathe life into the shadows. But I never imagined they would become harbingers of something far more sinister than mere architectural eccentricity. The inheritance came with more than just property deeds and musty furniture. It brought with it a creeping dread that settled into my bones the moment Sarah and I stepped through the front door for the first time as owners. The house had been in our family for 3 generations, yet somehow it felt like foreign territory. Hostile, unwelcoming, watching. Sarah noticed it first, naturally. My sister had always been more perceptive than me, more attuned to the subtle wrongness that others might dismiss as imagination. That first week, she mentioned feeling observed while walking the long corridor that connected the front parlor to the kitchen. The hallway stretched nearly 40 feet, lined on one side with those enormous stained glass panels, depicting biblical scenes in vivid blues, reds, and golds. I told her it was just the adjustment period, the way old houses take time to feel like home. But deep down, my gut churned with an unease I couldn't articulate. The house felt occupied in a way that had nothing to do with our presence. The first incident happened on a Tuesday evening. Sarah had been carrying a cup of tea from the kitchen when she suddenly stopped dead in the corridor, her face draining of color. When I asked what was wrong, she described seeing an elderly woman in a tattered gray dress moving through the hallway. Not walking, but gliding with unnatural fluidity. The figure had passed directly through Sarah's body, she claimed, leaving her with a sensation of profound cold that lingered for nearly an hour. I hadn't seen anything, but I had noticed something else. Something that made my spine crawl with inexplicable terror. As Sarah stood frozen in that corridor, every single stained glass panel had begun to vibrate with a barely perceptible tremor. The sound was almost inaudible, a whisper of glass against lead, but it seemed to resonate in my chest cavity like a struck tuning fork. My rational mind searched for explanations. Perhaps a truck had passed on the street outside, creating subtle vibrations. Maybe the old house was settling, or wind was moving through gaps in the window frames. But trucks didn't pass our isolated street at that hour, and the night was completely still. Sleep became elusive after that. I found myself lying awake, listening for sounds that shouldn't exist. Footsteps in empty rooms, the creak of floorboards under weight that wasn't there. And always, the faint singing of glass that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah's encounters became more frequent. She began describing the elderly woman in increasing detail. Hollow cheeks, eyes like dark voids, fingers twisted with arthritis, and a presence that felt ancient and malevolent. Each sighting left Sarah more drained, more hollow, as if something essential was being slowly drawn from her. My own experiences remained limited to that damned glass vibration, but it was growing stronger. What had started as a barely noticeable tremor was becoming a symphony of resonance that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The biblical figures seemed to shift and writhe within their lead-framed prisons, their painted eyes following my movement through the corridor. I began researching the house's history, desperate for rational explanations. What I discovered in the county records and newspaper archives made my blood run cold. Our great-grandmother hadn't been the original owner. The house had been built in 1887 by a wealthy widow named Constance Blackwood, who had lived there alone until her death in 1923. The circumstances of Constance's death were unclear. The obituary mentioned only that she had been found in the corridor, apparently having suffered some kind of episode, but a follow-up article from a week later revealed more disturbing details. Neighbors had reported seeing lights moving through the house for several days after her body was discovered. The local doctor who examined her remains noted an unusual phenomenon. Her body temperature was significantly below normal, even accounting for the time elapsed since death. More unsettling was the discovery that 3 subsequent owners had vacated the property under mysterious circumstances, all reporting similar experiences to what Sarah was describing. Each had mentioned seeing an elderly woman in the corridor, always moving from the parlor toward the kitchen, always passing through rather than around obstacles. The glass resonance was becoming unbearable. Every time Sarah encountered the apparition, the vibrations grew more intense, more musical, creating harmonies that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and penetrate directly into my nervous system. I began experiencing physical symptoms: nausea, dizziness, a constant sense of disorientation that made even simple tasks feel overwhelming. My paranoia reached a breaking point when I realized the pattern. The sightings weren't random. They occurred at the same time each evening, exactly 9:47 p.m. Sarah had begun positioning herself in the corridor at that hour, as if compelled by some force beyond her control. When I asked her why, she couldn't provide a coherent answer. She simply felt drawn there, she said, as if something was calling to her. I started timing the glass vibrations with obsessive precision. They began at 9:45 p.m. and reached their peak at exactly 9:47, continuing for precisely 3 minutes and 12 seconds before fading to silence. The mathematical precision of it filled me with a terror more profound than any ghost story. This wasn't random supernatural activity. It was purposeful, methodical, following rules I couldn't comprehend. The physical effects on Sarah became impossible to ignore. She was losing weight despite eating normally, her skin taking on a gray pallor that reminded me uncomfortably of old parchment. Dark circles formed under her eyes, and she moved with increasing lethargy, as if each encounter drained something vital from her being. My own health was deteriorating as well. The constant vibrations had begun affecting my equilibrium, leaving me nauseated and disoriented. I found myself gripping walls for support, my vision occasionally blurring as if the world itself was trembling. Sleep deprivation made everything worse. The shadows seemed deeper, the sounds more ominous, the very air thick with malevolent intention. One evening, I decided to position myself at the opposite end of the corridor from Sarah, hoping to observe the phenomenon from a different perspective. As 9:45 approached, my heart hammered against my ribcage with such violence I feared it might burst. My palms were slick with cold sweat, and my breathing came in short, shallow gasps that seemed inadequate to fill my lungs. The glass began its familiar tremor, but this time I was close enough to see something that made my sanity feel like a gossamer thread ready to snap. The painted figures in the stained glass panels weren't stationary. They were moving, not dramatically, but with subtle shifts that accumulated into undeniable animation. Eyes tracked left and right, mouths opened and closed in silent speech. Hands gestured with purposeful intent. At exactly 9:47, Sarah's body went rigid. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible, and her mouth opened in a soundless scream. The air in the corridor became thick and oppressive, filled with a presence so ancient and malevolent that my primitive brain screamed at me to run. But I couldn't run. I was transfixed by what I was witnessing. Through the trembling glass, I could see something moving, not the reflection of light or shadow, but an actual form passing through the solid panels as if they were merely colored water. The figure was exactly as Sarah had described, an elderly woman in a tattered gray dress, but seen through the glass, she appeared translucent, insubstantial, like a negative image burned into reality itself. The vibrations reached a crescendo that felt like it might shatter my skull. The painted figures in the glass were moving frantically now, their faces contorted with expressions of terror and anguish. They weren't depicting biblical scenes. They were trapped souls, prisoners in a crystalline purgatory, and they were trying desperately to warn us. That's when I understood. Constance Blackwood hadn't died in this corridor. She had been absorbed into it, becoming part of the house's structure, part of the glass that now sang with her imprisoned essence. Each evening at 9:47, she attempted to complete whatever journey she had been on when death claimed her. But she couldn't pass through physical matter without consequence. Each time she moved through a living being, she took something vital, some essential energy that sustained her existence between worlds. Sarah was her gateway, her means of sustaining herself in this liminal state between life and death. But the process was killing my sister slowly, draining her life force to fuel a presence that should have passed on decades ago. The realization hit me with the force of physical impact. I had to break the connection, had to find a way to prevent Constance from completing her nightly journey through Sarah's body. But how do you fight something that exists partially in the physical world and partially in some other dimension entirely? As the 3 minutes and 12 seconds elapsed, the vibrations faded, and Sarah collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. Her skin was even paler than before, almost translucent, and when she looked at me, her eyes held a quality I had never seen, as if someone else was looking out from behind them. That night I made a decision that would either save my sister or damn us both. I couldn't allow another encounter. I couldn't watch Sarah fade away, becoming a hollow shell while Constance Blackwood grew stronger. There had to be a way to trap the spirit, to prevent her from using the corridor as her supernatural highway. I spent the next day researching everything I could find about the house's construction, focusing specifically on the stained glass windows. What I discovered changed everything. The windows hadn't been installed when the house was built. They had been added in 1922, just 1 year before Constance's death. She had commissioned them personally, specifying not just the design, but the exact materials and construction methods. The glass contained unusual metallic inclusions, iron oxide and silver, creating specific resonant frequencies when subjected to electromagnetic fields. Constance hadn't just been a widow living alone in a big house. She had been a student of the occult, experimenting with ways to bind her spirit to the physical world beyond death. The windows were her anchor, her means of remaining earthbound, but they were also her prison. She could only manifest in the corridor because that's where her essence was trapped, in the glass she had specifically designed for this purpose. Armed with this knowledge, I knew what I had to do. At 9:45 p.m., I positioned myself directly in the center of the corridor, blocking the path between the parlor and the kitchen. Sarah tried to protest, but I could see the compulsion building in her eyes again, the unnatural need to position herself for Constance's passage. As the glass began its vibration, I planted my feet and prepared for impact. If Constance needed to pass through a living being to complete her journey, then she would have to go through me instead of Sarah. My hands trembled violently, my heart rate climbing to dangerous levels as the temperature in the corridor plummeted. At 9:47 exactly, she came. The sensation of her passage was unlike anything human experience should encompass. It was violation at the most fundamental level, the feeling of something alien and ancient moving through every cell of my body simultaneously. The cold was so intense it felt like burning, and for a moment, I shared consciousness with something that had been trapped in a hell of its own making for nearly a century. I felt her rage, her desperate need to complete whatever task had consumed her final living moments. But I also felt her fear, the terror of a soul that had trapped itself between worlds and could neither truly live nor properly die. The passage left me changed in ways I couldn't immediately comprehend. My vision was altered, allowing me to see the thin places where reality grew transparent. I could hear frequencies that shouldn't exist, music from dimensions that bordered our own. Most disturbing of all, I could feel Constance's presence lingering within me, a cold whisper of consciousness that had taken up residence in the darker corners of my mind. But Sarah was free. The compulsion that had been drawing her to the corridor each evening was broken, transferred to me along with the burden of being Constance's anchor to the physical world. We left the house 3 days later, abandoning it to whatever fate awaited properties cursed by their owner's refusal to accept death. But Constance Blackwood came with us. She exists now in the spaces between my thoughts, in the reflection that doesn't quite match my movements, in the sound of glass singing in the wind. Some nights, I catch Sarah watching me with concern, noting the way I sometimes stop mid-sentence to listen to voices only I can hear. She knows something changed in that corridor, that the price of her freedom was my own spiritual autonomy. I tell myself it was worth it. I tell myself that protecting her justified the sacrifice. But in the darkest hours before dawn, when Constance whispers her ancient secrets in my ear, I wonder if I've simply prolonged the inevitable. Because the dead, I've learned, are patient in ways the living cannot comprehend. And Constance Blackwood has all the time in the world to teach me the true meaning of eternity. Our story 12. The house breathed differently after midnight. Shallow, labored gasps that seemed to emerge from the very walls themselves. I'd noticed it the first night I moved in, but dismissed it as old wood settling, pipes expanding, the usual symphony of decay that accompanies century-old homes. How wrong I was. The inheritance came with strings attached, though I didn't realize it at the time. My great-aunt Marjorie had left me her Victorian house on Elm Street, complete with all furnishings and personal effects. The lawyer mentioned she'd been quite religious, but that hardly prepared me for what I found when I first walked through those creaking doors. Every room bore the weight of devotion. Crucifixes hung from door frames, religious paintings covered the walls in ornate frames, and small shrines occupied corners like silent sentinels. The dining room alone housed 14 different depictions of saints, their painted eyes following my movements with unsettling intensity. The living room featured an enormous wooden cross mounted above the fireplace, its dark surface worn smooth by generations of reverent hands. It was excessive, overwhelming. The house felt more like a chapel than a home, and I found myself holding my breath as I moved through the heavily shadowed rooms. My chest tightened with each step, as if the air itself had grown thick with centuries of whispered prayers and burning incense. The first week passed uneventfully enough. I busied myself with cataloging the contents, deciding what to keep and what to donate. The religious artifacts would definitely have to go. I wasn't particularly devout, and the constant presence of so many sacred images made me uncomfortable. They seemed to watch, to judge, creating an atmosphere of perpetual scrutiny that left my shoulders tense and my jaw clenched. I started with the smaller pieces: holy water fonts, prayer beads, miniature statues of angels and saints. Each removal felt like a small victory, a reclaiming of space that was rightfully mine. The house seemed to exhale with each departure, the oppressive weight lifting incrementally. My breathing became easier, my sleep more restful. But it was when I began taking down the paintings and crosses that things changed. The first sign came on a Tuesday evening. I'd spent the afternoon removing a series of faded lithographs depicting the Stations of the Cross from the hallway walls. The images had left pale rectangles against the darker wallpaper, ghost imprints of their former presence. As I carried the last one to the storage room, I could have sworn I heard something skittering across the floor above me. My heart jumped, pulse quickening as I froze mid-step. The sound was distinct, sharp clicks against hardwood, like fingernails tapping an urgent rhythm. I waited, listening, but heard only the house's usual sighs and creaks. Old houses made old noises, I reminded myself, though my hands trembled slightly as I set down the frame. The sounds became more frequent over the following days, always at night, always when I was alone, scratching in the walls, the soft patter of movement overhead, occasionally the distinct sound of something being dragged across the floor. My sleep grew fitful, my nerves frayed. I found myself jumping at every shadow, every unexpected noise. The house, which had felt oppressive before, now felt actively hostile. It was Thursday night when I decided to remove the large crucifix from my bedroom wall. The thing was massive, easily 3 feet tall, with a bronze Christ figure that seemed to glare down at me with accusatory eyes. I'd avoided it until now, but its presence made sleeping nearly impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt watched, judged, found wanting. Standing on a chair, I worked to unfasten the heavy mounting hardware. The cross resisted my efforts, as if welded to the wall itself. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I struggled with the stubborn screws, my breathing growing labored from exertion and something else, a creeping dread that made my skin crawl. When it finally came free, I nearly dropped it, the sudden release sending me stumbling backward. The wall behind bore a pale cross-shaped shadow, The wallpaper faded everywhere except where the crucifix had hung. In the center of this ghostly outline, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. 4 small holes, dark and perfectly round, as if something had burrowed into the plaster itself. I stared at those holes for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs. They seemed to pulse in the lamplight, expanding and contracting like tiny mouths gasping for air. My mouth went dry, and I had to grip the chair to steady myself as a wave of dizziness washed over me. That night, I placed the crucifix in the storage room with the other religious artifacts, though something inside me screamed against it. My hands shook as I closed the door, and I found myself checking the lock twice, 3 times, before finally retreating to my bedroom. I should have known better. The scratching started just after 3 a.m., jolting me from an uneasy sleep. This time it wasn't in the walls or overhead. It was right there in my room, a frantic scrabbling against the hardwood floor. My eyes snapped open, pupils dilating in the darkness as I tried to locate the source of the sound. The noise circled my bed in slow, deliberate arcs. Scritch, 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 like claws or fingernails dragging across wood. My breathing became shallow, barely controlled gasps as terror flooded my system. Every muscle in my body tensed, prepared for flight, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so primal it bypassed rational thought entirely. The scratching grew more frantic, more urgent. It seemed to be searching for something, probing every corner of the room with increasing desperation. I pulled the covers over my head like a child, knowing it was futile, but unable to stop myself. The scratching continued, growing closer to the bed with each pass. Then abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. I lay there, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, waiting for whatever came next. Minutes crawled by. My body was slick with cold sweat, sheets clinging to my clammy skin. Every shadow seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out from under the covers, the first pale light of dawn was filtering through the curtains. The room looked normal, peaceful even, but I could feel that something fundamental had changed. The house itself felt different, angry perhaps, or hungry. The very air seemed thicker, pressing down on me with malevolent weight. I spent the day researching the house's history, though what I found only deepened my unease. The property had been in my family for 4 generations, always passed down to the most devoutly religious relative. My great-aunt Marjorie had been the latest in a long line of zealots, spending her final decades in prayer and spiritual warfare against what she described in her journals as the darkness that dwells beneath. Her writings, which I discovered in a trunk in the attic, painted a picture of a woman at war with unseen forces. She wrote about binding rituals, protective wards, the constant vigilance required to keep something at bay. The entries grew increasingly paranoid and disjointed toward the end, filled with references to scratching sounds, moving shadows, and the absolute necessity of maintaining the sacred barriers. The final entry, dated just 3 months before her death, contained a single line that made my hands tremble as I read it. Should the crosses fall, it will find its way back into the light. That evening, I seriously considered replacing the crucifix in my bedroom. My rational mind rebelled against such superstitious thinking, but the fear gnawing at my gut was anything but rational. I paced the house as darkness fell, checking locks, peering into shadows. My nerves stretched to the breaking point. The scratching began again at 2:47 a.m. This time it was everywhere, in the walls, overhead, beneath the floorboards. A symphony of claws and nails creating a cacophony that seemed to emanate from the house's very bones. I bolted upright in bed, every nerve firing at once. The sound was overwhelming, filling my skull until I thought it might split open from the pressure. But worse than the noise was what accompanied it, a presence, something moving through the house with purpose and intelligence. I could feel it searching, testing, probing for weaknesses in whatever invisible barriers still remained. The temperature in the room plummeted, and my breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. The floorboards near my bed began to bow and creak as if something heavy was pressing up from beneath. I scrambled backward against the headboard, terror turning my limbs to jelly. The wood groaned and splintered, and for one horrifying moment, I thought something might actually break through. That's when I heard it, a sound that bypassed my ears entirely and resonated in my bones. It was calling, not with words but with pure intention, pure hunger. It knew I was there, it knew I was alone, and it wanted in. My body moved without conscious thought, muscle memory overriding paralyzed reason. I stumbled from the bed, legs barely supporting my weight as I staggered toward the storage room. My hands shook so violently I could barely work the lock, and behind me the scratching reached a fevered pitch. The storage room was tomb quiet, a pocket of stillness in the chaos that had engulfed the rest of the house. The crucifix lay where I'd left it, and as my fingers closed around its familiar weight, the scratching stopped as if a switch had been thrown. Carrying it back to my bedroom felt like moving through water. Each step was an effort of will against the fear that threatened to buckle my knees. The hallway stretched impossibly long, shadows seeming to reach for me with grasping fingers. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps that echoed in the sudden silence. Back in my room, I hefted the heavy cross toward the wall. The moment its base touched the pale outline it had left behind, the house shuddered. Not just the floorboards or walls, the entire structure seemed to convulse like a living thing. I pressed the crucifix firmly against the wall, fumbling for the mounting hardware with trembling fingers. As the final screw went home, securing the cross to its original position, the house exhaled. It was unmistakable, a long, slow breath that seemed to originate from deep within the foundation and work its way up through every beam and board. The oppressive weight that had been building for days lifted suddenly, replaced by something that almost felt like relief. From somewhere in the rafters came a sharp crack, the sound of wood settling back into its proper place. I collapsed onto the bed, adrenaline leaving my system in a rush that left me weak and shaking. The room felt normal again, peaceful even. The shadows had retreated to their proper corners, and the air moved freely once more. As dawn broke over the house on Elm Street, I finally understood the true nature of my inheritance. This wasn't just a home, it was a prison, a carefully constructed cage that had held something at bay for generations. The religious artifacts weren't mere decoration, but essential components of a barrier that couldn't afford to be broken. I never removed another cross, never took down another painting. The house and I had reached an understanding of sorts. I would maintain the sacred ward, and it would keep the darkness beneath where it belonged. Some inheritances, I realized, come with responsibilities that can't be shirked. But sometimes late at night, when the house breathes its measured sighs, I catch the faintest echo of scratching from somewhere far below. A reminder that some hungers never truly fade, only wait for their chance to climb back toward the light. Story 13. The metallic clang that shattered the 3 a.m. silence wasn't thunder. It was something far worse. It was the sound of intent, cold and deliberate, striking the concrete threshold of my apartment door like a declaration of war. I bolted upright in bed, heart hammering against my ribs with such violence I could feel it in my temples. The darkness seemed to press against my eyes, thick and suffocating. My mouth had gone dry, that peculiar cotton-mouth sensation that comes with sudden, primal fear. The sound echoed in my skull, replaying with crystalline clarity, metal on stone, sharp and final. For several minutes I remained frozen, every muscle in my body coiled tight as piano wire. My ears strained against the silence that followed, searching for any hint of movement in the hallway beyond my door. The building's old radiator system provided its usual symphony of creaks and groans, but underneath it all was something else, a quality of listening silence that made the hair on my forearms stand on end. When I finally worked up the courage to approach the door, my bare feet felt leaden against the cold hardwood. Each step seemed to echo through the building like gunshots. I pressed my eye to the peephole, but the hallway light had burned out weeks ago, leaving only an impenetrable black void on the other side of the lens. The deadbolt's mechanism felt stiff under my trembling fingers as I slowly, quietly, disengaged it. The door opened with the faintest whisper, and there it was, a professional lockpick set scattered across my threshold like metallic confetti. The tools gleamed dully in the emergency lighting from the stairwell, their presence both alien and menacing. My stomach dropped into free fall. Someone had been trying to break into my apartment. Someone had been right here, inches from where I slept, working on my lock in the dead of night. The violation felt almost physical, as if invisible hands had reached through the walls to touch me while I was at my most vulnerable. I gathered the tools with shaking hands, their weight surprising me. These weren't cheap novelty items, but professional-grade instruments, the kind used by locksmiths, or by people who had no business being inside other people's homes. The next morning brought no relief, only the harsh fluorescent reality of what had happened. I'd barely slept, every small sound in the building sending fresh jolts of adrenaline through my system. My coffee tasted like ash, and the familiar comfort of my apartment felt contaminated, as if the air itself had been poisoned by the intrusion. I decided to confront my upstairs neighbor about the lockpicks. Unit 201 had always been occupied by a man I'd seen only in passing. Tall, angular, with the kind of pale complexion that suggested he didn't spend much time outdoors. Our interactions had been limited to polite nods in the hallway, but something about him had always struck me as slightly off. Not threateningly so, just displaced, as if he existed slightly out of phase with the rest of the world. When I knocked on his door that afternoon, carrying the lockpicks in a small paper bag, he answered almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting. His eyes, a watery blue that reminded me of winter sky, flicked to the bag in my hands before meeting my gaze. I explained about finding the tools outside my door, about the sound that had woken me. His reaction was immediate and visceral. His face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, recognition, and then something that looked almost like embarrassment. He claimed they belonged to him, that he'd been returning from his workshop late at night when his ice pick set had slipped from his coat pocket. The explanation felt rehearsed, too smooth, but his apparent mortification seemed genuine enough. He apologized profusely, insisted that he'd been meaning to retrieve them all morning but hadn't wanted to disturb me so early. Ice picks, for his hobby of ice sculpting, he said. The explanation felt thin as tissue paper, but I found myself nodding along, desperate for any rational explanation that would restore some sense of normalcy to my world. But as I walked back down to my apartment, his words kept echoing in my mind with increasing dissonance. Ice picks didn't look like lockpicks. They were different tools entirely, with different purposes, different shapes. And what kind of ice sculptor worked at 3 a.m? The doubt began to eat at me like acid. I found myself replaying our conversation, analyzing every word, every gesture, every micro-expression. The more I thought about it, the more his explanation crumbled under scrutiny. That evening, as I stepped into my shower, I noticed something that made my blood turn to slush in my veins. A small, perfectly round hole in the ceiling directly above the shower head. Fresh plaster dust had fallen onto the tub's edge like snow. The hole was small, maybe half an inch in diameter, but it went all the way through to whatever lay beyond. My legs nearly gave out. I gripped the shower wall for support, my breathing becoming rapid and shallow. The hole was new. I showered every morning. I would have noticed it before. Someone had drilled through my ceiling. Someone had been watching. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The lockpicks hadn't been dropped accidentally. They'd been left behind after a successful entry. Someone had been in my apartment while I slept, drilling holes, installing surveillance equipment, violating every sanctuary I thought I had. I dressed with frantic, fumbling movements and examined the hole more closely. It had been drilled from above, the angle unmistakable. Tiny metal shavings clung to the edges, bright and new. I fetched a flashlight and aimed it upward through the opening. What I saw made my heart stop. The beam illuminated a small camera lens, no bigger than a button, staring down at me like a mechanical eye. It was mounted flush against the upper side of the ceiling, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The implications crashed over me in waves. How long had it been there? How long had I been watched during my most private moments? The thought made my skin crawl with phantom sensations, as if 1,000 insects were marching across my flesh. I stumbled backward, my breathing coming in ragged gasps. The bathroom suddenly felt impossibly small, the walls pressing in from all sides. Every shadow seemed to harbor additional threats. Every reflection in the mirror appeared distorted and wrong. My hands shook so violently, I could barely hold the flashlight steady. The camera remained motionless, a dead eye that had seen everything. My stomach lurched, and I barely made it to the toilet before dry heaving, my body rejecting the horror of discovery. Over the following days, paranoia became my constant companion. I found myself examining every inch of my apartment with obsessive thoroughness, searching for additional cameras, microphones, any sign of further intrusion. I discovered 2 more holes, one in the bedroom ceiling above my bed, another in the living room near where I usually sat to watch television. Each discovery felt like a fresh violation, as if invisible hands were reaching through the walls to strip away another layer of my privacy. I began covering the holes with tape, but the knowledge that they existed, that they had watched, remained like a splinter buried deep in my consciousness. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the building's old bones sent fresh spikes of adrenaline through my system. I would lie awake for hours, staring at the taped-over holes, imagining eyes behind them. When exhaustion finally claimed me, my dreams were filled with watchers in the walls, mechanical eyes that followed my every movement. I started spending less time at home, finding excuses to stay late at work, to visit friends, to walk aimlessly through the city until the late hours. But eventually, I always had to return. My apartment had become a trap, but it was my trap, the only place in the world that belonged to me, or had, before it was stolen from within. The man in 201 became an object of intense scrutiny. I found myself listening for his movements above, cataloging the sounds of his daily routine. He seemed to follow a rigid schedule. Awake early, periods of complete silence broken by brief episodes of activity, then nothing until late at night when I would hear what sounded like tools being moved around. I began timing my own movements to avoid him, leaving and returning when I was certain he was out. But sometimes I would catch glimpses of him through my peephole, standing motionless in the hallway for minutes at a time, as if listening. His presence in the building felt oppressive, like a storm front moving in. My physical condition deteriorated rapidly. The constant stress manifested in trembling hands, a persistent headache that throbbed behind my eyes, and a stomach that churned with anxiety. Food tasted like cardboard, and coffee left me feeling jittery and nauseous. Dark circles appeared under my eyes, and my reflection began to look like that of a stranger, hollow-eyed and haunted. Colleagues at work commented on my appearance, but I found myself unable to explain what was happening. How do you tell someone that your upstairs neighbor might be watching you through holes in your ceiling? How do you describe the feeling of being prey in your own home? I considered calling the police, but what evidence did I have? Holes in my ceiling that could have been there for years. A set of lockpicks that their owner had readily claimed. A growing conviction that I was being watched that sounded more like paranoid delusion than criminal activity. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night when insomnia drove me to my living room window. I was staring out at the street below when movement on the fire escape caught my attention. A figure was climbing down from the upper floors, tall, angular, moving with deliberate stealth. It was him, the man from 201, dressed entirely in black, carrying what looked like a small bag of tools. He moved like someone intimately familiar with the building's architecture, avoiding the squeaky sections of metal grating, keeping to the shadows. I watched him disappear into the alley below, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was proof, or as close to proof as I was likely to get. He was actively engaged in surveillance, using the fire escape to access vantage points throughout the building. The next day, I made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. I would confront him directly, armed with what I'd witnessed. The thought made my stomach churn with anxiety, but living in constant fear had become unbearable. I waited until evening, then climbed the stairs to the second floor. My legs felt weak, and sweat had begun to gather at my temples despite the building's perpetual chill. Each step seemed to echo through the stairwell like a gunshot. When I knocked on his door, the response was immediate. Too immediate, as if he'd been waiting just on the other side. The door opened to reveal his pale face, but something was different. His usual mask of polite distance had slipped, revealing something sharp and predatory underneath. His apartment was visible behind him, and what I saw there made my blood freeze. The walls were covered with photographs, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Pictures taken through windows, captured from hidden vantage points, showing people in their most private moments. The building's residents going about their daily lives, unaware they were being documented, and among them, prominently displayed, were photos of me. In my apartment, in my shower, sleeping in my bed. The violations documented in meticulous detail, cataloged like specimens. His eyes followed my gaze to the photographs, and when he looked back at me, his expression had changed completely. The pretense of normalcy had evaporated, leaving behind something cold and calculating. He told me, in a voice devoid of emotion, that I'd seen too much, that the building was his laboratory, its residents his subjects. That privacy was an illusion people clung to because reality was too uncomfortable to accept. The conversation that followed felt surreal, like a fever dream. He spoke about observation as art, about the beauty of capturing people in their unguarded moments. His voice never rose above a conversational tone, but every word felt like ice water in my veins. I backed away slowly, fighting the urge to run. Running would provoke chase instincts, and something in his demeanor suggested that would be very, very bad. Instead, I nodded as if I understood, as if his explanations made perfect sense. When I finally reached my own apartment, I called the police from my trembling hands. The responding officers were skeptical at first, but the holes in my ceiling and the description of what I'd seen in his apartment were enough to warrant investigation. They found everything I'd described and more. The man in 201 had been documenting the lives of everyone in the building for over 2 years. His apartment was a shrine to violation, filled with surveillance equipment, photographs, and detailed notes about our routines and habits. He was arrested without incident, his calm demeanor never wavering even as they led him away in handcuffs. But as the police car pulled away from the curb, I caught sight of his face through the rear window. He was smiling. The building emptied quickly after word spread about what had been discovered. Most residents broke their leases and moved away, unable to bear the knowledge of how long they'd been watched. I stayed longer than most, partly out of stubbornness, partly because moving felt like admitting defeat. But the apartment never felt the same. Even after the holes were professionally repaired, even after I'd changed all the locks and installed additional security measures, the sensation of being watched persisted. Some violations leave permanent scars, invisible but undeniable. When I finally moved out 3 months later, I left no forwarding address. I found a new place on the ground floor of a different building, with windows that faced busy streets and neighbors whose faces I could see clearly. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I still find myself checking the ceiling for fresh holes, listening for the sound of footsteps that might not belong. The man in 201 was sentenced to 2 years for breaking and entering, invasion of privacy, and illegal surveillance. But the real sentence, the knowledge that privacy is always provisional, that safety is always temporary, that watchers exist in the walls, that sentence lasts forever. I still have the lockpicks. They sit in a drawer in my new apartment, a reminder that some violations can never be undone, only survived. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of sleepless nights, I take them out and hold them in my trembling hands, wondering if somewhere out there, new eyes are learning to see through new holes, and if anyone is truly ever alone. Story 14. The first hole appeared on a Tuesday morning, perfectly round and no bigger than a quarter, carved through the ceiling directly above my pillow. Fresh wood shavings dusted my sheets like snow, pale and clean against the dark fabric. I discovered it when sunlight pierced through at an angle I'd never seen before, casting a thin beam across my face that woke me earlier than usual. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared up at that impossible opening, my mouth suddenly dry as cotton. The wood around the edges looked fresh cut, almost wet, with no signs of age or wear that might explain a natural collapse. My hands trembled as I brushed the shavings from my pillow. They felt real enough between my fingers, rough and fibrous, carrying the sharp scent of freshly sawn pine. I counted them compulsively, 17 pieces scattered across my bed, each one a tiny witness to whatever had happened while I slept. The building was old, a converted Victorian that had been sliced into 4 apartments. Mine occupied the second floor, with Mrs. Chen below, and the Hendersons to my right. Above stretched the communal attic space, accessible through a trapdoor in the hallway that both my upstairs neighbor Jake and I were supposed to share for storage. The landlord had explained this arrangement when I signed the lease 6 months ago, though I'd never had occasion to venture up there. I climbed onto my bed and pressed my eye to the hole. Darkness greeted me, thick and impenetrable, though I caught a whiff of something stale and organic that made my stomach clench. When I called up through the opening, my voice echoed strangely, as if the space above was both larger and smaller than it should be. Jake lived in the apartment across the hall. When I knocked on his door that morning, he answered in his bathrobe, hair disheveled, coffee mug steaming in his hand. I explained about the hole, watching his face carefully for any flicker of recognition or guilt. His confusion seemed genuine enough when he insisted he hadn't been in the attic for months, not since storing his ex-girlfriend's boxes up there in the spring. He offered to take a look, following me back to my apartment with the casual concern of a good neighbor. Standing on my bed beside me, he peered up through the hole and frowned. When he suggested it might be the result of settling or water damage, his voice carried none of the conviction his words attempted. We both knew that wood didn't drill itself into perfect circles. That afternoon, I bought a small flashlight and climbed through the hallway trapdoor to investigate. The attic stretched longer than I'd expected, running the full length of the building with a partition wall separating Jake's half from mine. Cobwebs hung like gray curtains between the rafters, disturbed by my movement into writhing shadows that made my skin crawl. I found the spot above my bedroom easily enough. A new hole punched through the floor, surrounded by fresh wood shavings that crunched under my shoes. But what stopped my breath entirely was the discovery of a second hole, this one only half finished, the drill bit still embedded in the wood, as if someone had been interrupted mid-task. My pulse roared in my ears as I examined the partition wall between the 2 attic halves. New screws gleamed silver bright against the old wood, at least a dozen of them driven deep into the boards. Someone had been working up here recently, reinforcing the barrier, or perhaps trying to breach it. The metal felt cold under my fingertips, and I jerked my hand back when I realized how much it trembled. Sleep became elusive after that. Every creak of the old building made me bolt upright, straining to hear footsteps above or the whine of a drill. I took to sleeping on the couch, abandoning my bedroom entirely, but even there I felt exposed and watched. The darkness seemed to press down on me with unusual weight, and more than once I caught myself holding my breath, listening for sounds that never came. On Thursday, I discovered the second completed hole. This one had appeared overnight, positioned directly above where my head would rest if I slept in my usual spot on the couch. Wood shavings again, scattered with the same deliberate precision, and when I pressed my eye to the opening, that same stale organic smell wafted down to meet me. My hands shook so violently I could barely dial Jake's number. When he answered, I could hear the irritation in his voice even before I explained. He repeated his earlier denial with less patience this time, suggesting I contact the landlord if I was so concerned about building maintenance. The conversation ended abruptly when he claimed to have somewhere important to be. I spent that day at the library, researching the building's history on their public computers. The Victorian had been a single-family home until the 1970s, when it was converted into apartments. Public records showed no unusual incidents, No police reports or insurance claims that might explain my situation. But as I scrolled through old newspaper archives, a small item from 1982 caught my attention. A previous tenant had reported strange noises and the feeling of being watched, eventually breaking his lease early due to what he described as an uninhabitable living situation. The landlord at the time had dismissed his complaints as the product of an overactive imagination, but reading those words made my chest tighten with recognition. That night, I positioned myself on the floor of my living room with a clear view of both the bedroom and the couch. Armed with the flashlight and my phone's camera, I intended to stay awake and catch whoever was terrorizing me. The plan seemed solid in the harsh light of evening, but as darkness settled over the apartment, my resolve began to crumble. Every shadow seemed to shift and breathe. The familiar sounds of the building, pipes settling, wood expanding, the distant hum of appliances, transformed into a symphony of threat. My heartbeat thundered so loudly I was certain it could be heard through the walls, announcing my location to whatever presence lurked above. Around 2 a.m, I heard it. The sound came from directly overhead, a rhythmic scratching that spoke of metal against wood. My breath caught in my throat as I realized someone was up there, working in the darkness while I cowered below. The noise continued for perhaps 10 minutes, methodical and patient, before falling silent again. I waited another hour before mustering the courage to investigate, my legs weak and unsteady as I climbed back into the attic. The flashlight beam danced wildly as my hands trembled, casting moving shadows that seemed alive and malevolent. A third hole had been started above my makeshift bed on the floor, the drill bit buried halfway through the wood. But it was the sight of the partition wall that sent ice flooding through my veins. Someone had removed several of the new screws, creating a gap large enough for a person to squeeze through. Fresh scratches in the wood showed where metal tools had been used to pry the boards apart. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam sweeping across the disturbed area, and that's when I saw them. Footprints in the dust, leading from the gap in the wall directly to the holes above my living spaces. But they weren't coming from Jake's side of the attic as I'd expected. Instead, they originated from somewhere deeper in the partition itself, as if someone had been living inside the walls. My scream caught in my throat as the full implications hit me. The holes weren't random vandalism or even stalking in any conventional sense. Someone had been watching me sleep for months, studying my habits from within the building structure, learning when I was most vulnerable. The fresh screws hadn't been meant to reinforce the wall. They'd been installed to seal someone inside, to hide them from view while they carved their spy holes and planned whatever came next. The flashlight slipped from my nerveless fingers, rolling across the floor and casting wild shadows as it spun. In the chaos of moving light, I caught a glimpse of something pale withdrawing deeper into the partition, like a hand pulling back from view. I ran then, stumbling through the darkness toward the trapdoor, my breath coming in ragged gasps that burned my lungs. Behind me, I could hear movement in the walls themselves, a rustling and scratching that followed my retreat. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if the entire structure had come alive around me. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys as panic overwhelmed rational thought. As I drove away, I caught sight of my apartment building in the rearview mirror. Every window was dark except for one, a faint glow emanating from what should have been solid wall between the second and third floors. I spent the remainder of the night in a 24-hour diner, staring at my phone and trying to decide who to call. The police would want evidence I didn't have, explanations for events that defied logic. Jake's number appeared in my recent calls, but something in his voice during our last conversation had shifted, becoming distant in a way that suggested he knew more than he'd admitted. As dawn broke over the city, I made my decision. I would return to collect my belongings and leave immediately, forfeiting my security deposit rather than spending another night under those watching eyes. But first, I needed to understand what I was dealing with, who had been living in my walls, and why they'd chosen me as their target. The building looked normal in daylight, almost cheerful with morning sun warming its faded brick facade. Other tenants moved about their routines, Mrs. Chen watering her window plants, a delivery truck idling at the curb. Everything appeared exactly as it should, which somehow made it more terrifying than if it had been obviously wrong. I climbed the stairs to my floor with leaden feet, my keys ready, but my hands still shaking from the previous night's discoveries. The hallway trapdoor hung open, a black square in the ceiling that I didn't remember leaving that way. As I stood beneath it, considering whether to investigate further, a folded piece of paper fluttered down to land at my feet. My name was written across the front in careful block letters, the handwriting eerily familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd seen it before. Inside, a single sentence had been written in the same precise script. The holes were for you to see me, but you weren't ready yet. The paper crumpled in my grip as understanding washed over me like ice water. This wasn't random stalking or malicious vandalism. Someone had been trying to communicate, to make contact through those carefully placed openings. The holes hadn't been meant to spy on me. They'd been windows, invitations to acknowledge a presence that had been waiting patiently for recognition. As I stood in that ordinary hallway, surrounded by the familiar sounds of urban morning life, I realized that leaving wouldn't solve anything. Whatever had been living in my walls knew where I worked, what car I drove, probably every detail of my routine. The holes would appear wherever I went next, growing more numerous and deliberate until I finally understood what was being asked of me. The note trembled in my hands as I read it again, searching for clues about what kind of response was expected. But even as rational thought urged me to flee, a deeper part of my mind whispered that perhaps it was time to stop running from whatever had been so patiently trying to reach me from the darkness above. Story 15. The December air held a sharpness that cut through the thin walls of my new apartment, carrying with it the scent of something long dead and forgotten. I'd been living in this cramped space for 3 weeks, and tonight marked my first attempt at making it feel like home. The artificial Christmas tree stood crooked against the far wall, its plastic branches reaching toward the water-stained ceiling like desperate fingers. Each ornament I hung seemed to absorb the weak light from the single bulb overhead, creating dancing shadows that made my skin crawl. I should have known something was wrong the moment I signed the lease. The landlord's hands had trembled when he passed me the keys, and his eyes never quite met mine. The rent was impossibly low for downtown, even for a place this rundown. But desperation makes you ignore red flags, and I needed somewhere to disappear after everything fell apart back home. The building itself felt diseased. Paint peeled from the hallway walls like scabs, revealing layers of sickly yellow underneath. The elevator hadn't worked in months, according to Mrs. Chen from 3B, forcing residents to climb the narrow stairwell that reeked of mildew and something else. Something metallic that made my throat tighten whenever I breathed too deeply. My apartment sat on the 4th floor, corner unit, isolated from the few other tenants who seemed to move through the building like ghosts. As I reached for another ornament, a small red bell that had belonged to my grandmother, the silence broke. A low murmur drifted into my left ear, so close I could feel the vibration against my eardrum. The sound was guttural, primordial, like words spoken in a language that predated civilization. My hand froze mid-reach, the bell trembling between my fingers. The murmur came again, longer this time, and I spun around expecting to find someone behind me. The apartment stretched empty. My heart hammered against my ribs with enough force to make my shirt flutter. I pressed my palm against my chest, trying to slow the frantic rhythm, but my pulse only accelerated. The silence returned, thick and oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of traffic 4 stories below. I turned back to the tree, convincing myself it had been pipes settling or wind through the old window frames. But as I lifted the ornament toward a bare branch, my elbow brushed against something unexpected. The Christmas light I'd just hung swayed, and beneath it, pressed into the wallpaper like a brand, was a dark stain. My fingers found the ornament's hook and carefully removed the light. The stain became fully visible, a mark of pure black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. At first glance it looked like soot or char, but as I leaned closer, the randomness resolved into deliberate lines. Curves and angles formed a symbol I didn't recognize, but that made something deep in my chest constrict with primal fear. The mark appeared freshly made, as if someone had pressed a burning coal against the wall moments before my arrival. But I'd been in the apartment all evening, and the wall had been clean when I started decorating. My hand reached toward the symbol, then stopped inches away. The air around it felt different, thicker, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand at attention. I backed away from the wall, my legs suddenly unsteady. The ornament slipped from my fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor, the sound sharp enough to make me flinch. Pieces of red glass scattered across the room like drops of blood, catching the overhead light and throwing crimson reflections onto the walls. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while every creak and groan of the old building sent adrenaline shooting through my veins. The symbol burned in my mind's eye, its twisted lines seeming to shift and writhe even in memory. Twice I got up to check the wall, convinced I'd imagined the whole thing, but each time the mark remained, dark and definite against the faded wallpaper. The murmuring returned at 3:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I was watching the digital clock, using its green glow as an anchor to reality. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, a low rumble that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves. It lasted 37 seconds. I counted each one, then cut off so abruptly that the silence felt violent. Morning brought no relief. Exhaustion weighed on my shoulders like wet concrete, and my hands shook as I made coffee. The symbol remained unchanged, but something about the apartment felt different. Shadows lingered in corners where sunlight should have reached. The air tasted stale, metallic, like old pennies left in a closed jar. I spent the day researching. My laptop balanced on my kitchen table. I typed variations of what I'd seen into search engines. Ancient symbols, occult markings, ritualistic signs. Hours passed in a blur of websites and forum posts, most filled with conspiracy theories and amateur archaeology, but buried in an academic paper about pre-Columbian religious practices. I found something that made my blood freeze. The symbol matched perfectly with one described in a colonial-era document from Salem. The paper referenced a journal entry from 1672, written by a Puritan minister who'd encountered similar markings in a house where unexplained phenomena had been reported. The minister described the symbol as a gateway mark, used in rituals to thin the boundary between the physical world and what he called the spaces between spaces. According to the journal, the marks appeared spontaneously in homes where the barrier between dimensions had been deliberately weakened. The minister wrote of voices in unknown languages, of shadows that moved independently of their sources, and of residents who slowly lost their grip on reality as the influence from beyond seeped through. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I couldn't stop reading. The minister's account grew increasingly frantic as he described the escalating phenomena. Furniture moving without explanation, temperature drops that left frost on windows in the middle of summer, and always, the marks appearing in new locations, spreading like an infection through the affected buildings. The journal ended abruptly. The final entry, dated 3 weeks after the first, consisted of only a single line repeated 127 times. It sees me, it sees me, it sees me. I slammed the laptop shut and pushed back from the table. My apartment felt smaller than before, the walls pressing inward like the chamber of a collapsing lung. The symbol seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision, demanding attention even when I deliberately looked away. That evening, I discovered 2 more marks. The first appeared behind my refrigerator, only visible when I moved the appliance to retrieve a dropped pen. This symbol was smaller, but more intricate, with spiraling lines that hurt to look at directly. The second manifested on the bathroom mirror, etched into the silvering like acid burns. When I breathed on the glass, the fog revealed additional lines, creating a pattern so complex my eyes couldn't follow its complete structure. The murmuring grew stronger each night. What had started as whispers became conversations in that guttural, alien language. I could hear multiple voices now, some deep enough to vibrate through the floor, others high and sharp like breaking glass. They seemed to come from inside the walls, from beneath the floorboards, from spaces that couldn't possibly exist. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt watched. The sensation was so intense it was almost physical. A pressure against my skin, a warmth that shouldn't be there. I installed motion sensor lights in every room, but they triggered constantly with no visible cause. The bulbs burned out within days, leaving me in darkness broken only by the pale glow of my phone screen. By the end of the first week, I'd stopped eating regularly. Food tasted like ash, and my stomach cramped whenever I tried to swallow. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a stranger, hollow-eyed, pale, with skin that seemed too tight across my skull. The symbol on the glass had grown larger, its lines now covering nearly half the surface. I called the landlord, desperate for answers about the apartment's history. His voice cracked when he heard my address, and he claimed to know nothing unusual about the building. But before hanging up, he mentioned that the previous tenant had left suddenly, abandoning most of his belongings. The super, a bent man named Frank, who smelled of cigarettes and despair, was more forthcoming. Over a shared beer in the building's basement, he told me about the others who'd lived in my apartment. None had stayed longer than 2 months. All had left without notice, sometimes in the middle of the night. One had been found 3 days later in a psychiatric facility, claiming that something was trying to crawl into his mind through cracks in reality. Frank's hands shook as he described finding my apartment after each departure. Furniture overturned, windows painted black from the inside, and always those symbols carved or burned into every available surface. The building owner hired cleaning crews to scrub away the marks, but they always returned within days of a new tenant moving in. The basement conversation took place on a Thursday. By Saturday, symbols covered every wall in my apartment. They appeared faster now, materializing while I watched, lines burning themselves into paint and wallpaper and wood. The voices grew loud enough that I couldn't distinguish them from my own thoughts. Sometimes I caught myself responding to them, my lips moving around words in that impossible language. The boundaries of my perception began to blur. Shadows moved when nothing cast them. The temperature fluctuated wildly, ice forming on the windows one moment, sweat beating on my forehead the next. Objects relocated themselves when I wasn't looking. My coffee mug appeared in the refrigerator. Books arranged themselves in patterns that spelled out symbols. The bathroom faucet ran red water that smelled of copper and fear. I knew I should leave. Every rational part of my mind screamed for escape. But something held me there. A compulsion that felt foreign yet irresistible. The symbols seemed to pulse with life, drawing my attention, commanding my presence. I found myself tracing their lines with my fingertips, feeling the heat that radiated from them like brands fresh from the fire. The revelation came on the 10th night. I was standing before the original symbol, the one behind the Christmas tree, when my vision suddenly sharpened. The mark wasn't burned into the wall, it was carved into reality itself. Through the gaps in its twisted lines, I could see something else. Another space, vast and dark, where things that shouldn't exist moved with purpose and hunger. They had been watching me through those cracks. Not malevolent entities from some hellish dimension, but something far worse. Aspects of consciousness that existed in the spaces between thoughts, in the gaps where sanity faltered. They fed on confusion, on the dissolution of rational thought, on the moment when a mind stopped trusting its own perceptions. The apartment wasn't haunted, it was infected. Each symbol was a wound in the fabric of reality, allowing these parasitic thoughts to seep through and nest in the minds of the residents. They didn't want to possess or destroy. They wanted to transform, to reshape human consciousness into something more compatible with their alien nature. As understanding flooded through me, I felt my grip on reality loosening. The voices weren't speaking to me. They were speaking through me, using my vocal cords to form words in their impossible language. My hands moved without conscious direction, picking up a kitchen knife and beginning to carve new symbols into the wooden floor. But in that moment of absolute terror, as I watched myself become a conduit for something inhuman, a spark of defiance ignited. The part of me that remained unchanged, that still remembered who I'd been before the symbols appeared, fought back with desperate fury. I couldn't destroy the marks. They existed beyond physical reality, but I could deny them what they needed. I could refuse to surrender my sanity, could choose chaos over the alien order they offered. With enormous effort, I forced my hand to drop the knife. The blade clattered against the floor, its sound sharp and real in a world that had become fluid and uncertain. The voices rose to a shriek, the symbols flaring with painful brightness. The apartment shook as if reality itself was convulsing. Then everything stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. The symbols remained, but their power had broken. They were just marks now, dark stains with no more meaning than spilled coffee or water damage. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, leaving behind only the mundane problems of a run-down apartment in a bad neighborhood. I packed that night, throwing my few possessions into boxes without care for organization. By dawn, I was gone, leaving the keys on the kitchen counter next to a note explaining nothing. The landlord could keep my deposit. 3 months later, I live in a different city, in a bright apartment with large windows and neighbors who actually speak to each other. I sleep through the night now, and food tastes like food again. But sometimes, when I'm very tired or very stressed, I catch glimpses of symbols in my peripheral vision. They fade when I look directly at them, but their presence lingers like an itch I can't quite reach. I've learned that some kinds of knowledge can't be unlearned. The things that exist in the spaces between spaces are still there, still watching, still waiting for the next person desperate enough to ignore the warning signs. They don't need to invade our reality. They just need us to invite them in. One symbol at a time, one broken mind at a time. The building still stands. Frank tells me they haven't found a tenant willing to stay in my old apartment for more than a week. The symbols reappear within hours of any cleaning attempt, and the murmuring starts again as soon as someone tries to sleep there. Sometimes I wonder about the others who lived there before me, whether any of them understood what was happening, whether any of them escaped with their sanity intact. But mostly I try not to think about it at all. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. The Christmas tree is probably still there, crooked against the wall, its plastic branches heavy with dust and the weight of something that should never have been awakened. And behind it, burned into reality itself, the first symbol continues to pulse with patient hunger, waiting for the next lost soul to stumble into its web of whispered madness.